Akhenaten. Ruling Egypt from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, Pharaoh Akhenaten is one of the most visually distinctive figures in all of ancient history, and the debate over why he looks the way he does in art has never fully been resolved. Walk through any museum with an Egyptology collection, and you will notice immediately that something is different about his depictions. While traditional pharaohs are shown as idealized, muscular, and symmetrically proportioned, Akhenaten appears with a dramatically elongated skull, a protruding jaw, wide childbearing hips, a soft pendulous belly, thin spindly limbs, and a facial structure that looks almost alien compared to every other ruler of his dynasty. Two broad explanations compete for dominance among historians and medical researchers. The first is that this was deliberate artistic convention, a new visual language invented to reflect Akhenaten's radical religious revolution, in which he dismantled the Egyptian pantheon and elevated the sun disk Aten as the singular divine force in the universe. Under this theory, his elongated and androgynous form was meant to communicate that he existed outside ordinary humanity, simultaneously male and female, simultaneously human and divine, a living embodiment of a teen on Earth. The second explanation is that his depictions reflect a genuine physical condition. Medical researchers over the decades have proposed Marfan syndrome, which causes tall, thin frames and elongated features; Froelich syndrome, which causes hypogonadism and a redistribution of fat toward the hips and abdomen, or a familial form of gynecomastia paired with another hormonal disorder. Neither camp has definitively won the argument, and the truth may be some combination of both. A real physical difference that the Amarna artistic style then exaggerated and theologized. What makes the case genuinely compelling is that the evidence does not stop with the art. A landmark 2010 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association analyzed the royal mummies connected to Akhenaten's family line using CT scanning and DNA testing, and the results were striking. Tutankhamun, almost certainly Akhenaten's son, had a clubfoot, a cleft palate, bone necrosis in his foot, and evidence of multiple malaria infections. The study identified a probable pattern of close inbreeding within the 18th dynasty royal family that would have concentrated recessive genetic mutations across generations. So whatever Akhenaten's personal conditions were, his lineage was producing physically compromised heirs, and the art of Amarna, with its swollen bellies and strange skulls, may have been capturing something real, even while stylizing it for religious purposes. There is a final layer of irony worth sitting with. His wife Nefertiti is represented in the famous painted limestone bust, now in the Berlin Egyptian Museum as one of the most symmetrically beautiful human faces ever rendered in ancient art. The contrast between how the royal couple were depicted was not accidental. It makes Akhenaten's form even more deliberately, strikingly other, chosen and framed as visually separate from ordinary human beauty, in a way that served his theological agenda even if it also reflected his body. Agesilaus II. Sparta was the ancient world's most famous eugenicist society, a city-state that, according to Plutarch and other ancient sources, practiced the ritual exposure of physically imperfect newborns on the slopes of a site called the Apothids, leaving infants deemed too weak or malformed to survive and die. The supreme irony, then, is that one of Sparta's greatest kings was born lame. Agesilaus, born around 444 BCE, had a congenital condition affecting one of his legs that left him with a pronounced limp for his entire life. Before he even took the throne, his disability generated a religious controversy. An oracle from Delphi had reportedly warned Sparta to beware of a lame kingship, and when Agesilaus' claim to the throne was contested, his opponents pointed directly to the prophecy and to his body as disqualifying factors. Plutarch, writing his Life of Agesilaus, approximately 5 centuries after the fact, is the primary surviving source for most of what we know about him, and Plutarch describes his lameness alongside his modest physical stature in terms that make his subsequent military dominance all the more remarkable. Despite being small, visibly disabled, and initially dismissed as unfit to lead, Agesilaus became the most powerful Spartan king of his era, leading campaigns deep into Persian territory in the 390s BCE and dominating the politics of the Greek world for decades. His survival and rise to power are genuinely difficult to square with the popular image of Sparta as a society that had zero tolerance for physical imperfection, and the most honest conclusion is that the system had significant flexibility when it came to elite bloodlines, that the rules of Spartan eugenics were applied selectively depending on who your father was. What Plutarch also records is that Agesilaus had a dry, unsentimental humor about himself, a quality that ancient sources treat as part of his character, rather than a compensatory mechanism. He reportedly made a point of sitting with ordinary soldiers rather than elevating himself physically, which reads either as genuine egalitarianism or as a very calculated act of leadership theater designed to neutralize the awkwardness of a limping king among the most physically demanding warrior culture in the ancient world. He died around 360 BCE at approximately 84 years old on a military campaign in North Africa, which is a remarkable lifespan for any ancient person and an almost implausible one for a man who had spent decades on active campaign. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, where Thebes crushed Sparta's military supremacy under the command of Epaminondas, happened during Agesilaus' reign, and some ancient sources blamed his aggressive foreign policy for overextending Sparta into that disaster. A lame king who had arguably stretched the most fearsome military machine in Greece beyond its limits, and then outlived the consequences by a decade, campaigning into his 80s on foreign soil. Claudius. The Roman Emperor Claudius, born in 10 BCE and ruling from 41 to 54 CE, presents one of history's most complete portraits of a royal whose physical presentation was weaponized against him from birth, only for the historical record to ultimately vindicate him. Suetonius, in The 12 Caesars, provides one of the most detailed physical descriptions of any ancient ruler. Claudius walked with an unsteady, shambling gait. His head trembled continuously. He slobbered when he was agitated or laughing. His laughter became unseemly, and his speech was characterized by a harsh, stammering voice. His family's reaction to all of this was, by any measure, extraordinary in its cruelty. Suetonius records that his grandmother Livia treated him with nothing but contempt, that his mother Antonia called him a monster of a man not finished by nature, and that letters survive in which Augustus himself agonized over what to do with him at public events, worrying that Claudius's visible physical differences would embarrass the imperial family. As a result, Claudius spent most of his early life in a kind of domestic exile, kept away from public duties, steered towards scholarship rather than governance, and largely ignored as a political entity. Modern medical analysis has proposed several possible explanations for his symptoms, with cerebral palsy, Tourette syndrome, and residual neurological damage from a severe childhood illness all appearing in the scholarly literature, though no definitive diagnosis has been established and likely never can be. What history does record with great clarity is that the family that kept him hidden underestimated him catastrophically. When the Praetorian Guard discovered him hiding behind a curtain during the chaos following Caligula's assassination in 41 CE and declared him emperor, the Senate had little choice but to accept. Claudius then proceeded to govern the Roman Empire with genuine administrative skill for 13 years. He reformed the civil service, expanded citizenship, managed the grain supply, oversaw significant legal reforms, and in 43 CE successfully invaded Britain, adding the province that would become one of the empire's most significant long-term holdings. He wrote serious historical works on Etruscan and Carthaginian history, now entirely lost but attested by multiple ancient sources, and his interest in legal procedure and bureaucratic organization produced lasting institutional changes in how Rome functioned. He was most likely poisoned by his wife Agrippina the Younger in 54 CE, who preferred to see her son Nero on the throne. Nero subsequently did everything he could to diminish Claudius's legacy. The Senate deified him, which Nero mocked, and the biographer Seneca wrote a satirical piece called the Apocolosyntosis, mocking Claudius's physical traits for laughs. The man the Julio-Claudian family hid as an embarrassment turned out to be more capable than most of them. His physical presentation was treated as evidence of his mind. It was not. Justinian II of the Byzantine Empire earned one of history's most vivid royal nicknames, Rhinomatos, which translates from Greek as the slit-nosed. He did not receive this name at birth. He earned it in 695 CE when a palace coup led by a general named Leontios had him dragged from the throne, subjected to rhinotomy, the Byzantine practice of surgically removing or severely mutilating the nose, and exiled to Cherson in Crimea. The logic of renotomy as a political tool was culturally specific and brutally practical. Byzantine imperial ideology held that the emperor's body must be whole and unblemished as a reflection of divine favor, meaning that a visibly mutilated man was theoretically disqualified from imperial rule. Cutting off a rival's nose was, in theory, a merciful alternative to execution that permanently removed the threat. What Justinian the coup proceeded to do with that assumption is one of the most remarkable comebacks in medieval political history. He refused to disappear. In exile in Crimea, he made contact with the Khazar Khagan, whose name is recorded in Byzantine chronicles as Ibuzuros Gliabanos, and married his daughter Theodora. When that alliance became politically complicated, he escaped and made his way to the Bulgarian court, where Khan Tervel agreed to provide military support in exchange for significant territorial concessions. In 705 CE, Justinian Tin, noseless, exiled, and written off, arrived at the walls of Constantinople with a Bulgarian army, entered the city through an old disused water conduit, and retook his throne. Some sources in the tradition, though the specific details should be treated cautiously, suggest he wore a golden prosthetic nose to project undiminished imperial majesty, which, if true, represents perhaps the most audacious act of royal theater in the entire medieval period. His second reign, from 705 to 711 CE, was defined by systematic vengeance against everyone who had participated in his overthrow. Mass executions, mutilations carried out against his enemies using the same tools that had been used against him, and increasingly erratic governance characterized the period. He was overthrown a second time in 711 CE, and killed, his head dispatched to Rome and Ravenna as proof of his death. What his story reveals is the central mechanism of royal deformity in a political context. The mutilation was designed to disqualify him by making his body legible as unfit for power, and he spent 16 years proving that the logic of the body as political symbol could be defied, survived, and turned into a weapon of its own. Charles II of Navarre. Charles II of Navarre, who ruled from 1349 to 1387 and is remembered by history under the thoroughly earned nickname Charles the Bad, spent most of his political career engaged in a complex and bloody web of betrayal, assassination, and shifting alliances during the long crisis of the Hundred Years' War. His deformity came not from birth, but from the manner of his dying, a death so grotesque it reads like medieval fiction but is attested in chronicle sources. In his later years, Charles developed a severe and wasting illness, possibly erysipelas or another systemic skin condition, that caused his body to deteriorate dramatically. His physicians prescribed a treatment involving cloth soaked in medicinal spirits being wrapped around his body, a medical intervention consistent with practices of the era. According to chronicle accounts, which should be treated with some caution given the political appetite for darkly appropriate endings for a man called the Bad, a careless servant or attendant attempted to seal or cut the cloth using a candle flame, and the spirit-soaked wrappings caught fire. Charles burned across most of his body and survived for several agonizing days before dying in 1387. The chronicler Jean Froissart, whose accounts of the Hundred Years' War period are among the most detailed surviving sources, covers the political career of Charles II extensively, though the precise primary source for the death account should be verified against the original chronicle texts. What makes Charles worth, including beyond the manner of his death, is that his political life had been equally defined by a kind of calculated ruthlessness that bordered on compulsion. In 1354, he arranged the murder of Charles de la Cerda, the Constable of France, and a favorite of King John II, stabbing him personally according to some accounts. He repeatedly offered and then withdrew allegiance to both the French and English crowns, played the Navarrese succession against every available political pressure point, and was imprisoned by John II of France before escaping and continuing his schemes. His death by fire, his body destroyed by the very medicine meant to preserve it, struck contemporaries as a punishment that fit the man. Whether or not the story is embellished, it entered the historical record as a kind of dark moral conclusion to a life defined by burning through alliances and human lives. Richard III. Richard III of England, the last Plantagenet king, who ruled from 1483 to 1485, is almost certainly the most famous deformed monarch in Western literary and historical consciousness. But the gap between what he actually was and what he was made into is one of the most instructive stories in the history of royal propaganda. William Shakespeare's Richard III, written around 1592 to 1594, opens with Richard himself announcing his own villainy in direct address to the audience, and the play constructs his twisted, withered body as the outward sign of an inwardly corrupt soul, a hunchback with a withered arm and a dragging leg who uses his ugliness as both motivation and method for his crimes. That portrait of a man defined by his physical difference as a monster dominated the historical perception of Richard for 4 centuries. Then, in September 2012, a skeleton was discovered beneath a Leicester City Council car park on the site of the former Greyfriars Friary, and the University of Leicester confirmed through DNA matching to a matrilineal descendant named Michael Ibsen, and through forensic analysis of the bones that the skeleton was almost certainly Richard III. What the skeleton actually showed was both confirming and complicating. Richard did have significant scoliosis, an adolescent onset lateral curvature of the spine that would have made his right shoulder visibly higher than his left, and altered his posture and gait in ways that contemporaries would have noticed and remembered. The curve, while significant, was far from the grotesque hunched deformity of Shakespeare's imagination, and forensic facial reconstructions produced from the skull show a face that is fine-featured and not obviously unusual. Crucially, the skeleton showed a right arm that was entirely normal, directly disproving the withered arm that Shakespeare makes central to his character. That detail, the withered arm, appears to have been political propaganda, originating from accusations Richard made during his seizure of power in 1483, when he accused Elizabeth Woodville and others of having bewitched him, damaging his arm through sorcery, a claim designed to justify political executions rather than document genuine physical reality. The bones also recorded the manner of his death with extraordinary specificity. Multiple perimortem wounds to the skull, consistent with being struck repeatedly at close range, confirming that Richard died in close combat at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, not fleeing but fighting, which aligns with the accounts of contemporaries who noted his personal courage in his final charge. The real Richard, a man with scoliosis who was a competent and physically active military commander, was transformed by the Tudor propaganda machine, and then by Shakespeare into a monster whose body announced his soul. The skeleton gave him a more complicated and more human story back. Juana of Castile. Juana I of Castile, born in 1479 and died in 1555 at the age of 75, spent 46 of those years imprisoned in the castle of Tordesillas, declared unfit to rule by her husband, then her father, then her own son, across 3 successive generations of men who each had compelling political reasons to keep Spain's legitimate queen locked away behind stone walls. History has remembered her as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad, and that nickname has defined her in popular memory more completely than almost any other label attached to any other royal in European history. The question of whether she was genuinely mentally ill, or whether she was a politically inconvenient woman whose power was systematically stolen, is one that modern historians have revisited with significant energy. Bethany Aram's 2005 scholarly work, Juana the Mad, is among the most rigorous modern reassessments, and its conclusions are deliberately cautious, acknowledging that Juana showed genuine signs of severe psychological distress, particularly following the death of her husband Philip I in 1506, while also documenting that those around her consistently amplified and exploited whatever genuine vulnerability she had to justify controlling her. Philip, known as Philip the Handsome, used her emotional states as justification for sidelining her politically during their joint reign from 1504 to 1506. After Philip died suddenly at age 28, Juana's grief was extreme, and the famous story that she refused to allow his coffin to be buried, traveling with it across Spain and reportedly opening it to view or touch his body, has become her defining image in popular culture, a picture of a woman unhinged by love. The details of that story vary considerably between sources and should not be taken as straightforward historical record. What is straightforwardly documented is that her father Ferdinand of Aragon used her apparent incapacity as justification to govern Castile as regent, and that when Ferdinand died in 1516, her son Charles, who would become Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1519, continued the arrangement, keeping his mother confined at Tordesillas while ruling her kingdoms. Juana never abdicated. She remained technically Juana of Castile until her death, the legitimate ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, locked in a room in a Castilian castle while her son governed Mexico, Peru, the Netherlands, and half of Europe in her name. Her case established a template for the removal of inconvenient female rulers through the medicalization of emotion, treating grief and anger and resistance as symptoms of madness, rather than as reasonable responses to an extraordinary series of political violations against her person and her authority. Suleiman II. Suleiman II of the Ottoman Empire, born in 1642 and ascending to the Sultanate in 1687, spent approximately 39 years confined in the institution known as the cafes, which translates from Ottoman Turkish as the cage, before emerging at the age of 45 to rule one of the most powerful states on earth. The cafes was a section of the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople where Ottoman princes were kept in luxurious but total isolation to prevent them from becoming focal points for coups or succession crises. The logic was understandable from a dynastic stability perspective. The Ottoman practice of fratricide, in which a new sultan would execute all his brothers upon ascending, had been replaced by a system of confinement that preserved the bloodline while neutralizing its political danger. The practical consequences of that confinement, however, were devastating. Princes in the cafes were often attended by deaf-mute servants, specifically to prevent information from reaching or leaving them. They had no political education, no military training, no experience of governance or administration, and in many cases limited meaningful human contact for decades. When Suleiman II was brought out of the cafes in 1687 following the deposition of his brother Mehmed IV, contemporary accounts record that he wept and begged not to be killed, apparently unable in the first moments of his liberation to process that he was being crowned rather than executed, a response that captures with terrible clarity what 4 decades of fearful, isolated confinement had done to him. His physical condition upon emerging was described as deteriorated, visibly aged beyond his years, weak and confused. His reign lasted only until 1691, a period of 4 years during which the Ottoman military continued to suffer the consequences of the catastrophic defeat at the Second Battle of Vienna in 1683, a disaster that had occurred under his predecessor, but whose reverberations defined Suleiman II's entire time on the throne. What makes his case distinctive in this context is that it represents a different category of royal physical and psychological damage. Not a congenital condition, not a disease, not an accident, but the systematic product of an institution designed to preserve the dynasty by destroying the individuals within it. The cafes produced sultans who were simultaneously royal by bloodline and broken by experience, and Suleiman II is its most poignant documented case. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain, born on November 6, 1661 and died on November 1, 1700, is almost certainly the most medically extreme case of sustained royal inbreeding in the documented history of European monarchy, and possibly the most comprehensively physically compromised individual ever to sit on a major throne. A 2009 study published in the journal Human Biology calculated his inbreeding coefficient at approximately 0.254, a figure that places him in a range of genetic relatedness to himself that exceeds what would be produced by a sibling pairing, the result of generations of Habsburg dynastic intermarriage so recursive that his family tree contains the same names looping back across multiple branches. His great-grandmother was also his grandmother. His family connections, traced back through Philip II, Philip III, and the Austrian Habsburg line, created a genetic bottleneck of extraordinary severity. The physical consequences were visible from infancy. He could not walk until he was approximately 8 years old. He could not speak clearly until he was approximately 10. He had the pronounced mandibular prognathism known as the Habsburg jaw, in its most extreme recorded manifestation, a jutting lower jaw so severe that his teeth could not meet properly, and he was unable to chew solid food, meaning he swallowed much of what he ate whole, which caused chronic digestive problems throughout his life. His tongue was reportedly so enlarged that he drooled consistently, and his speech was difficult for courtiers to understand even in adulthood. He suffered from frequent convulsions, chronic illness across virtually every year of his 38-year life, and was described by multiple contemporaries as mentally slow. Though the specific nature of any cognitive difference is impossible to diagnose retrospectively with precision, his subjects and contemporaries, unable or unwilling to blame the obvious cause, his family's systematic marriage policy, called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, attributing his afflictions to supernatural curse. An autopsy report from the Spanish court, whose specific reliability and chain of transmission should be treated with some caution, reportedly described his body in terms of almost total systemic failure. An extremely small heart, lungs described as corroded, intestines gangrenous and rotten, and other signs of catastrophic organ deterioration. He died childless at 38, and the absence of an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which ran from 1701 to 1714 and involved virtually every major European power, killing hundreds of thousands and redrawing the political map of Europe. The man whose broken body could not produce an heir managed in death to reshape an entire continent. His case is the logical endpoint of a system that prioritized the concentration of dynastic power over every other consideration, including the basic biological viability of the human beings it produced. Peter III. Peter III of Russia, born on February 21, 1728, ruled the Russian Empire for exactly 6 months, from January 5 to July 9, 1762, before being overthrown by his wife, who would become Catherine the Great, and dying in custody shortly afterward, most likely murdered, with Alexei Orlov, one of Catherine's key supporters, frequently named as the probable killer in the historical literature. His reign was brief enough that it might be dismissed as a footnote, except that nearly every account of his time in power reads like a detailed portrait of a man profoundly unequipped for the office he held. And the question of whether that unpreparedness reflected genuine cognitive or developmental differences, or was exaggerated by a court that needed him to appear incompetent, is one that honest historians must hold carefully. The primary challenge in assessing Peter III is that almost everything recorded about him came through sources controlled by or sympathetic to Catherine, who had every conceivable incentive to paint him as a grotesque fool whose removal was a mercy to Russia. With that caveat firmly in place, the picture that emerges is still striking. Peter had survived a severe case of smallpox that left his face heavily pockmarked, and some historians suggest may have caused neurological aftereffects that contributed to the behavioral patterns contemporaries found so alarming. He was described physically as weak-framed, with irregular and unpleasant features, small and unprepossessing beside the imposing Catherine. His behavior at court was characterized by what accounts describe as a kind of arrested development. He played obsessively with toy soldiers as an adult, conducted elaborate mock military drills with courtiers as participants, and allegedly held a formal court-martial and execution of a rat that he discovered had eaten one of his toy soldiers, a story that appears in multiple secondary sources but whose original primary documentation should be traced carefully. He openly kept a mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova, whom contemporaries described in unflattering physical terms, and showed Catherine conspicuous contempt, while simultaneously fearing her physical and intellectual presence. Whatever the precise nature of his differences, his governance was not purely chaotic. He abolished the feared secret chancellery, the Russian secret police apparatus, issued the Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility, and withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War in what became known from Prussia's perspective as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, saving Frederick the Great from what had appeared to be certain military defeat. That last decision, driven by Peter's intense personal admiration for Frederick, turned the Russian military and aristocracy against him decisively. An army and nobility that had fought and bled for years suddenly saw their sacrifices erased by a czar who, in their view, admired the enemy more than he valued Russian blood. Catherine's coup on July 9, 1762 met essentially no resistance. Peter III was dead within 8 days. The gap between the broken, toy-obsessed figure of Catherine's narrative and the man who issued genuine legislative reforms in 6 months suggests that the historical record of his physical and mental state has been curated by the woman who replaced him, and that the truth, as with so many royal bodies throughout history, was at least partly constructed by those who needed it to justify what they had already decided to do. Tutankhamun. The boy king of ancient Egypt died around age 18 or 19, could not walk without assistance, and left behind over 130 walking sticks, many of them worn smooth from actual use, not ceremony. That detail alone should tell you something is wrong. Tutankhamun ruled Egypt's 18th dynasty around 1332 to 1323 BCE, and when Howard Carter cracked open his nearly intact tomb on November 4, 1922, the world got its first real look at a royal bloodline that had been folding in on itself for generations. The science came later. In February 2010, a team led by Zahi Hawass published a landmark genetic study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, using short tandem repeat analysis on royal mummies to reconstruct a 5-generation family tree. What they found was not a family tree so much as a loop. Tutankhamun's father was almost certainly Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who briefly dismantled Egyptian religion and redirected worship toward the sun disk Aten. His mother, according to the DNA analysis, was a woman identified in the tomb KV35 only as the younger lady, and the study's data strongly suggests she was Akhenaten's own sister, making Tutankhamun the product of a full sibling union. That gives him an estimated coefficient of inbreeding of approximately 0.25, the same probability of homozygous recessive gene expression you would expect from a child whose parents were full siblings. And that is a floor estimate, not a ceiling, because the generations before Akhenaten were themselves already compressed. The theology made this feel not only acceptable, but sacred. In Egyptian religious cosmology, the god Osiris married his sister Isis, and the god Set married his sister Nephthys. Pharaohs were living gods, divine on earth, and their blood could not be permitted to mix with the blood of ordinary humans without diluting the divine essence the throne required. So they married inward. Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun's grandfather, married a daughter. The divine bloodline stayed pure. The immune system did not. The physical inventory of Tutankhamun's body, drawn from CT scans and DNA analysis, reads like a medical catastrophe. He had Kolar disease too, a condition involving bone necrosis in the foot, causing one of his feet to collapse inward. He had a club foot. He had a cleft palate, the severity of which remains debated among scholars. He had multiple bone abnormalities across his skeleton, consistent with what geneticists call inbreeding depression, the physical expression of recessive genetic defects that only emerge when both copies of a gene carry the same flaw. He had at least 2 confirmed infections of Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal strain of malaria. He was, in short, a young man whose body was failing him from multiple directions simultaneously. The walking sticks were not decorative. They were load-bearing. He died around 1323 BCE, and while a minority of scholars have proposed a chariot accident as the cause of death, the current scientific consensus leans toward the accumulated weight of bone disease, repeated malaria infection, and an immune system compromised by genetics. He was a god-king who could barely walk, in an empire that worshipped physical perfection, and his dynasty's devotion to divine purity is precisely what made him so fragile. Cleopatra VII. If Tutankhamun represents one dynasty's brush with inbreeding, the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt represents a full institutional commitment to it spanning nearly 300 years. Cleopatra VII, who ruled from 51 to 30 BCE and is the most famous of the Ptolemaic rulers, was the final product of a deliberate genetic experiment that began when Ptolemy II Philadelphus married his own full sister, Arsinoe II, around 279 BCE. The name Philadelphus literally means sibling-loving in Greek, and the Ptolemies wore it as a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. The reasoning was partly theological, echoing Egyptian divine marriage customs, and partly political, keeping power from fragmenting across multiple families. Whatever the reasoning, the effect over 12 generations was what geneticists call pedigree collapse, a condition in which a family tree stops branching outward and begins folding back on itself, with the same individuals appearing in multiple ancestor positions simultaneously. Running a genealogical analysis on even 5 generations of Ptolemaic rulers produces a diagram that looks less like a tree and more like a knotted rope. Cleopatra's precise parentage carries some genuine historical uncertainty. Her father was Ptolemy XII Auletes, an unstable ruler who was temporarily expelled from Egypt by his own subjects and had to bribe his way back to the throne with Roman money. Her mother's identity is not definitively established in surviving records, but the leading scholarly interpretation is that she was a half-sibling or close relative of Ptolemy XII, which would have been entirely consistent with Ptolemaic practice. This means Cleopatra entered the world already carrying a substantial coefficient of inbreeding accumulated across a dynasty that had been marrying sideways for centuries. She then, in the Ptolemaic tradition, married 2 of her younger brothers in succession, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, serving as their co-ruler and nominal wife, though no children came from either union. Her children were fathered by Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, both Romans, both genetically distant from the Ptolemaic line, which is worth noting. And here's the part that confounds easy narratives about inbreeding. Cleopatra showed none of the physical symptoms of inbreeding depression that might be expected. According to Plutarch's account in the Life of Antony, written roughly a century after her death, she was magnetically compelling, fluent in approximately 9 languages, including Egyptian, which made her unique among Ptolemaic rulers who generally never bothered to learn the language of the people they ruled. and intellectually formidable enough to conduct diplomacy with the two most powerful Roman men of her era largely on her own terms. This does not mean the inbreeding had no effect. It means that a high coefficient of inbreeding indicates a probability of harm, not a certainty. Some individuals with compounded recessive genetics escape physical expression entirely. Others are devastated. Cleopatra appears to have drawn a fortunate genetic hand from a very stacked deck. The dynasty was not so lucky collectively. Ptolemaic rulers had a documented history of erratic behavior, violent family murders, and political instability that accumulated across generations. The experiment ended in 30 BCE when Cleopatra died. Rome absorbed Egypt, and the 3-century project of keeping a divine bloodline genetically sealed collapsed along with the kingdom it was meant to protect. Claudius. The fourth Roman Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, limped, stammered, had a head that shook involuntarily, and drooled. Ancient sources, including Suetonius in his work The 12 Caesars, cataloged these traits in clinical detail, and the ancient interpretation was straightforward: weakness of character, evidence of a man unfit to rule. Modern historians have offered more precise possibilities, including cerebral palsy, Tourette syndrome, and other neurological conditions, some of which may carry genetic dimensions, though none can be diagnosed with certainty across 2,000 years. What can be documented is the dynasty that produced him. The Julio-Claudians, spanning Augustus through Nero, were built on a web of intermarriage between the Julian and Claudian families, so dense that by the time Claudius sat on the throne, the same bloodlines had been circulating through the same narrow aristocratic gene pool for 4 generations. Augustus married Livia, who brought her son Tiberius from a previous marriage into the imperial family. Tiberius then married Julia, the daughter of Augustus, making him the stepson and son-in-law of the same man simultaneously. Caligula, who preceded Claudius, reportedly entered into religious ceremonial marriages with his own sisters, a level of dynastic consolidation that even Rome found uncomfortable. Each generation pulled the genetic circle tighter. Claudius then married his own niece, Agrippina the Younger, in 49 CE. Agrippina was the daughter of his brother Germanicus, making this a direct uncle-niece union, and it was legally awkward enough that the Roman Senate had to pass a specific decree permitting uncle-niece marriage, which had previously been classified as incest under Roman law. Agrippina brought with her the accumulated Julio-Claudian inbreeding of prior generations, concentrating the compression further. She was also, by most historical assessments, considerably more capable as a political operator than Claudius himself, and she likely arranged his death by poison, with mushrooms as the delivery mechanism, according to Tacitus's account in the Annals, in order to secure the succession of her son Nero. Nero, himself a product of this genealogical loop, then proceeded to murder his own mother, kick his pregnant wife to death, and eventually drive Rome to the point of revolt before being declared a public enemy by the Senate and dying by suicide in 68 CE. The Julio-Claudians are included here not because Claudius represents the highest coefficient of inbreeding in this list, he almost certainly does not, but because his dynasty illustrates how cumulative dynastic inbreeding works in practice across generations, each marriage compressing the gene pool a little further, each generation inheriting not just a throne but a tightening biological inheritance, until the line produces a Nero and then collapses entirely. Al-Hakim bi-Amr-Allah. The sixth Fatimid Caliph and Imam, Al-Hakim bi-Amr-Allah, ruled Egypt and much of North Africa and the Levant from 996 to 1021 CE, ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in 1009, banned women from leaving their homes so comprehensively that he also banned the manufacture of women's shoes to enforce the restriction, ordered every dog in Cairo killed because their barking disturbed him, and then disappeared on a night walk into the Muqattam Hills in 1021 and was never seen again. His donkey was found later with blood-stained garments nearby. No body was ever recovered. The Druze religion, which emerged from his court around 1017 CE, holds that he did not die but entered a state of occultation, a divine concealment, and will return at the end of time. The Fatimid Caliphate that produced him was an Ismaili Shia dynasty that claimed direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, and that claim of divine lineage created intense theological pressure to keep the bloodline sealed and contained. Across 6 generations of close succession before Al-Hakim, the Fatimid genealogical structure accumulated meaningful pedigree collapse, though precise coefficient of inbreeding figures are not calculable from surviving records and should not be cited as hard numbers. What can be said is that The dynasty practiced the deliberate restriction of its bloodline in ways consistent with the patterns that produce elevated COI across generations. Al-Hakim's behavior, documented by contemporaries, including the scholar and physicist Ibn al-Haytham, who served at his court and wrote about the period, was extraordinary even by the standards of absolute rulers who operated without meaningful checks on their power. His edicts lurched between the puritanical and the arbitrary. Grapes were banned, reportedly to prevent wine production. Certain professions were prohibited, restrictions were imposed and then reversed, seemingly at random. In his later years, he became increasingly reclusive, wandering the hills at night alone in simple dress and describing encounters with divine truths. The interpretation of this behavior has varied widely across the centuries. Medieval chroniclers called it tyranny. The Druze called it divinity. Some modern historians have suggested that al-Hakim experienced what we might recognize as a genuine psychiatric condition, possibly with genetic dimensions given the dynasty's structure, though this framing is speculative and should be held carefully. What is not speculative is the political consequence. The destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 sent a shock through Christian Europe that contributed to the conditions Pope Urban II would invoke nearly 90 years later when calling the First Crusade in 1095. A caliph's erratic behavior, whatever its origins, set events in motion that would reshape the medieval world. Juana la Loca. Juana I of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad, was never actually removed from her title. She was Queen of Castile from 1504 until her death on April 12, 1555, a reign of 51 years, 46 of which she spent confined at the castle of Tordesillas, unable to exercise any power, unable to leave, essentially imprisoned by her own father Ferdinand II of Aragon, and later by her son the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, both of whom found it politically convenient to have a mad queen on the throne, whose madness prevented her from governing. Whether Juana was genuinely psychiatrically ill, whether she was a politically inconvenient woman deliberately pathologized by the men around her, or whether she suffered from grief so extreme that it became indistinguishable from madness in her era, is a question historians continue to debate. And the honest answer is probably that all three things were true simultaneously. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, the legendary Catholic monarchs who funded Columbus and completed the Reconquista, were themselves second cousins, a close enough relationship to require a papal dispensation to marry legally. That dispensation gave Juana a baseline coefficient of inbreeding before she married into the Habsburgs. She married Philip III of Castile, known as Philip the Handsome, in 1496. Philip was a Habsburg, and the Habsburgs were already accumulating their own genealogical compression from prior generations of strategic intermarriage across the royal houses of Central Europe. When Philip died suddenly on September 25, 1506, in Burgos, at age 28, Juana's behavior became what her contemporaries labeled madness. She reportedly refused to leave his coffin. She traveled with his body across Spain for months, reportedly opening the casket periodically, as though unable to accept the death. She kissed his feet. She refused to let women near the body out of what was described as jealous possessiveness that extended beyond death. This is the behavior that history has most often cited as evidence of her insanity. It is also the behavior of a woman in catastrophic grief who had no institutional support, no political allies who were not simultaneously her captors, and whose husband had been the one person in her life who held power independent of her family's control. She was confined at Tordesillas in 1509. She was 46 years there. Juana is on this list not primarily because of her own COI, though it was meaningful, but because she is the hinge point, the genealogical pivot between the Trastamara and Habsburg dynasties, and the inbreeding of those two lines flowing together through her produced children, whose genetic compression would build with each generation. Her son Charles V had an estimated COI of approximately 0.093. Her great-great-great-grandson Charles II of Spain had an estimated COI of approximately 0.254. The queen who spent half a century locked in a castle is the origin point of the most genetically compressed dynasty in recorded European history. Suleiman the Magnificent, the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, reigned from 1520 to 1566, led 13 major military campaigns, issued a comprehensive legal code so respected that his own subjects called him Kanuni, the lawgiver, composed poetry under the pen name Muhibi, and died at approximately 71 years old during the siege of Sigetvar on September Sector 7, 1566 of natural causes, which is worth pausing on because natural causes at 71 after a reign of 46 years is not the outcome you expect from a dynasty practicing the same genetic compression strategies as the others on this list. The Ottoman Empire did not practice those strategies, at least not structurally, and Suleiman is on this list precisely to make that contrast legible. The Ottoman succession system deliberately sourced women for the imperial harem from diverse geographic and ethnic backgrounds, Circassian, Greek, Slavic, Albanian, and others, maximizing the genetic distance between the sultan and his consorts. Sultans did not, as a rule, marry their concubines, and the mothers of princes were generally not related to the imperial family in any way that would produce a meaningful coefficient of inbreeding. The result? Across a dynasty that ran from 1299 to 1922, more than 600 years, was a ruling line with among the lowest accumulated COI of any long-running royal dynasty in history. Suleiman himself broke the romantic pattern in a historically significant way. He fell in love with a woman known in the West as Roxolana, born Hürrem Sultan, likely of Ruthenian origin, and formally married her, making her his legal wife rather than simply a favored concubine, the first Ottoman sultan to formally marry in over a century, a decision so unusual it generated rumors and controversy across diplomatic Europe. This did not compromise the dynasty's genetic strategy. If anything, it underscored it. She was as genetically distant from the Ottoman bloodline as it was possible to be. The Ottoman Empire's longevity, its political stability relative to its enormous size, and the general health of its ruling line across 6 centuries almost certainly benefited from the structural genetic openness. None of this was altruism. The Ottomans maintained their dynasty through a practice of fratricide, legally codified under Mehmed II's Kanunname, in which a new sultan would have all his brothers executed upon taking the throne to eliminate succession rivals. The genetic diversity of the ruling line was preserved at the cost of mass murder within it. Suleiman himself had his own son Mustafa strangled on suspicion of plotting against him. The Ottomans kept their chromosomes healthy and their politics brutal, which is a different kind of dysfunction than the Habsburgs, but a dysfunction nonetheless. Philip II of Spain. Philip II of Spain had a coefficient of inbreeding estimated at approximately 0.211, according to genealogical analysis including the work of Alvarez and colleagues published in PLOS 1 in 2009, placing him in territory that population geneticists associate with serious health risk long before he reached the age when his body began its documented collapse. He was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal, who were first cousins. He was the great-grandson of Juana la Loca. He inherited not only the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from Spain to the Philippines, which were named for him, to the Americas, to Portugal after his annexation of that kingdom in 1580, but also a genetic compression that had been building for 3 generations. He married 4 times. His first wife, Maria of Portugal in 1543, was his first cousin. His 4th wife, Anna of Austria in 1570, was his own niece, the daughter of his sister Maria, and Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. And it was this 4th marriage, uncle to niece, that produced Philip III, who continued the line. Each marriage choice reflected the Habsburg policy of keeping power within the bloodline, and each one wound the genetic spring a little tighter. The physical consequences arrived on schedule. Philip began experiencing severe gout from his 30s onward. Gout, caused by the buildup of uric acid crystals in the joints, is agonizing under any circumstances, but Philip's case progressed into something beyond ordinary gout. By his later years, he could not move his fingers. He could not walk. He was carried everywhere through the immense granite corridors of El Escorial, the palace monastery he had built in the mountains north of Madrid, complete in 1584, which he then largely never left. He dictated correspondence from bed and annotated documents himself rather than delegating, a habit so compulsive that the French called him the roi papyracier, the paper king, and El Escorial's archives contained tens of thousands of papers in his own handwriting. He also suffered from eczema and kidney problems, and in his final years, open sores spread across much of his body. Contemporary accounts, though their precise sourcing requires careful verification, describe conditions so severe that treatment was impossible without causing him additional agony, and that he bore this suffering with deliberate religious patience. He died on September 13, 1598, and the empire he left behind was already showing the strains that would accelerate under the diminished heirs his genetic legacy helped produce. Philip II was capable, meticulous, and ruthless. He was also the clearest signal yet that the Habsburg bloodline was approaching a biological limit that political will alone could not override. Rudolf II. Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who reigned from 1576 to 1612, was the son of Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, who was Philip II's own sister, making Rudolf the nephew of Philip II and the product of a double Habsburg marriage, both his parents carrying the accumulated inbreeding of the Habsburg line, their COI flowing together in him. His estimated coefficient of inbreeding falls in a range consistent with the broader Habsburg compression of his generation, though precise figures require careful sourcing against genealogical literature. Rudolf never married, producing only illegitimate children, and this paradoxically interrupted the direct genetic compression in his line, while creating a succession crisis that his brother Matthias eventually resolved by staging what amounted to a political coup, stripping Rudolf of his kingdoms one by one between 1608 and 1611. Rudolf died in January 1612, reportedly in a state of fury and isolation, surrounded by the extraordinary collection of objects he had spent his reign accumulating, stripped of every kingdom except the nominal imperial title. What makes Rudolf historically remarkable and genuinely strange is the gap between his political dysfunction and his cultural achievement. He moved the imperial court from Vienna to Prague, installed himself in Prague Castle, and proceeded to fill his Kunstkammer, his wonder cabinet, with one of the most extraordinary collections in Renaissance Europe, paintings by Dürer, Bruegel, and Arcimboldo, scientific instruments, automata, natural curiosities, maps, astronomical tools, and objects from across the known world. He invited Johannes Kepler to Prague in 1600 as imperial mathematician, and Kepler arrived to work alongside Tycho Brahe, who died in Prague in 1601. The observations Brahe had accumulated and that Kepler inherited and analyzed under Rudolf's patronage became the foundation for Kepler's laws of planetary motion, published in Astronomia Nova in 1609, a work dedicated to Rudolf himself. The same ruler whose depressive episodes lasted months, who refused to conduct state business for extended periods, who became so reclusive that foreign ambassadors sometimes could not get an audience for years, who was consumed by astrology and alchemy, and his collections to the exclusion of governance, presided over one of the most scientifically and artistically fertile courts in European history. The painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo made Rudolf the subject of a portrait composed entirely of fruits, vegetables, and flowers, a whimsical and strange image for a whimsical and strange emperor. Whether Rudolf's mental deterioration reflected genetic factors, the crushing psychological weight of ruling a fractured empire during the lead-up to the 30 Years' War, some combination of both, or something else entirely, cannot be determined at this distance. What can be said is that he was a Habsburg. He was the product of a compressed genealogy, and his dysfunction followed a pattern that the dynasty was producing with increasing reliability across generations. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain had a coefficient of inbreeding estimated at approximately 0.254, according to the analysis by Alvarez and colleagues published in PLOS 1 in 2009 under the title, The Role of Inbreeding in the Extinction of a European Royal Dynasty. That figure requires a moment of explanation to fully land. A child born to two full siblings would have a COI of 0.25. Charles II's COI exceeded that threshold, not because his parents were full siblings, they were not, but because the inbreeding had been compounding across 9 generations of Habsburg intermarriage, each generation adding another layer of genetic compression until the accumulated effect surpassed what a single generation of sibling reproduction would have produced. Juana la Loca, the queen who spent 46 years confined at Tordesillas, appears in Charles II's family tree in multiple ancestor positions, the same individual occupying several different branches of a genealogy that had long since stopped branching. His mother was Mariana of Austria, his father was Philip IV of Spain. Mariana was Philip IV's niece. His family tree, when drawn out completely, does not look like a tree. It looks like a diagram of something collapsing. The physical expression of that collapse was total. Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, and from the beginning his body communicated the genetic catastrophe it represented. He was not weaned until age 5 or 6, some sources suggest, because he physically could not manage solid food. He walked late. He talked late. He had the Habsburg jaw, the mandibular prognathism that appears across multiple generations of the dynasty, but in Charles II it reached an extreme that no prior Habsburg had experienced. His lower jaw protruded so severely that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, making chewing mechanically impossible. He swallowed food in large pieces, which caused chronic digestive problems throughout his life. His tongue was described by contemporaries as so large that his speech was difficult to understand. He had epilepsy. He had what his contemporaries described as hallucinations, interpreted at the time as evidence of demonic possession, which led to multiple exorcisms being performed on him by priests who believed, not unreasonably by the standards of their era, that what they were witnessing was supernatural in origin. A 2019 study published in Annals of Human Biology proposed a more precise genetic explanation, identifying that Charles II likely suffered simultaneously from two rare autosomal recessive conditions: combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis. Both conditions require inheriting two copies of the defective gene, which only converges at the kind of frequency that extreme consanguinity produces, and both together could account for his documented symptoms across multiple body systems. He was also impotent. He married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1688, who died in 1689, and then to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690, and neither marriage produced an heir. He spent much of his reign incapacitated and was described by observers as appearing decades older than his actual age. The royal autopsy conducted after his death on November 1, 1700, at age 38, produced an account recorded in contemporary letters, including correspondence from the papal nuncio, though the reliability of autopsy reports from this era is imperfect, describing a body ravaged beyond what his age alone could explain. Charles II's death without an heir ended the Spanish Habsburg line and immediately triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which ran from 1701 to 1714, drew in England, France, Austria, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and Savoy, killed hundreds of thousands of people across Europe and the Americas, and permanently redrew the map of European power. A dynasty's genetic experiment, begun with the marriages of Ferdinand and Isabella and compressed across 9 generations of deliberate cousin marriage, concluded with a king who could not chew his food and whose death without an heir set the continent on fire: Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901 and died on January 22nd of that year at age 81, had a relatively modest coefficient of inbreeding by the standards of this list. Her parents, Edward, Duke of Kent, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, were first cousins once removed, giving her a COI that was meaningful by ordinary standards, but unremarkable compared to the Habsburgs or Ptolemies. She is the closing entry on this list, not because she was the most inbred monarch in history, but because she illustrates a different kind of genetic catastrophe, one that required no accumulated inbreeding at all, only a single mutation, a strategic marriage policy, and a continent full of interconnected royal families waiting to receive it. Victoria was a carrier for hemophilia, a condition that prevents proper blood clotting and can cause a person to bleed internally from minor injuries or spontaneously into their joints, causing excruciating pain and progressive joint damage. A 2009 genetic study by Rogev and colleagues published in Science, which analyzed DNA extracted from remains of the Romanov family, confirmed that the specific variant was hemophilia B, caused by a mutation in the F9 gene on the X chromosome, revising the earlier assumption that it had been hemophilia A. The critical point is that the mutation appears to have been de novo, meaning it arose spontaneously in Victoria herself or in one of her parents, rather than being inherited from the earlier generations. It was new. No prior royal had carried it. Victoria either never knew she was a carrier or refused to acknowledge the possibility, and she had 9 children, whom she strategically married across the royal houses of Europe in a deliberate effort to cement British diplomatic influence, a policy so successful that she was called the grandmother of Europe. The mutation traveled with her daughters and granddaughters. Her son Leopold was the hemophiliac himself and died at age 30 from a brain hemorrhage following a minor fall. Her daughter Alice passed the gene to her daughter Alex, who became Alexandra Feodorovna upon her marriage to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia in 1894. Their son Alexei, born in 1904, had hemophilia B. The bleeding episodes that periodically brought Alexei to the edge of death created the opening for Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic who appeared to have some capacity to calm the boy during crises, possibly through hypnosis, reducing stress-induced vasoconstriction, possibly through other mechanisms that historians still debate. Rasputin's access to the imperial family became total. His influence over Alexandra became absolute. His presence in the inner circle of the Romanov court became a source of scandal, political destabilization, and eventually a focal point for aristocratic resentment so intense that a group of nobles murdered him in December 1916, a killing so difficult that it generated its own mythology. The damage to the Romanov dynasty's credibility and stability contributed to the conditions that enabled the Russian Revolution of February and October 1917, the abdication of Nicholas II, and ultimately the execution of the entire Romanov family, including the hemophiliac boy Alexei in a basement in Yekaterinburg on July 17, 1918. Victoria's granddaughter Ina, Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906 and introduced the mutation into the Spanish royal line, where two of their sons were hemophiliacs, and the condition contributed further to the political turbulence of a monarchy already under strain. Victoria's case closes this list because it makes the underlying lesson impossible to ignore. The dynasties that practiced deliberate inbreeding over centuries did so in the belief that controlling bloodlines meant controlling power. Victoria's dynasty barely inbred at all by royal historical standards, and a single spontaneous mutation, distributed across Europe through the same strategic marriage network that was supposed to secure British influence, helped bring down 3 ruling houses. Genetics does not care about the political logic of the people who carry it. It keeps its own ledger across generations, across borders, across centuries, and the bill always eventually comes due. Queen Mary, Saint of England. Queen Mary then is often remembered as the more sympathetic half of the William and Mary double act, a Protestant queen who co-ruled Britain with her Dutch husband and died young of smallpox at 32, but the genetic reality of her place in royal history is something that tends to get glossed over in favor of the political drama. Mary was the daughter of James II of England and his first wife Anne Hyde, and while that marriage was not itself consanguineous in any remarkable way, the dynasty Mary was born into had already been quietly threading its own bloodlines together for decades. Mary married her first cousin William III of Orange in 1677, a union that was not an accident of romance but a deliberate piece of political engineering by the English Parliament, which needed a Protestant heir and found one by pairing 2 members of the same extended Stuart family. Their shared great-grandparent was King James I of England, which placed their inbreeding coefficient at approximately 0.6, modest by the standards of what this video will go on to describe, but significant enough to mark them as a consanguineous couple by any clinical definition. The marriage was cold at first. Mary reportedly wept when she learned she was to marry William, finding the match neither romantic nor personally appealing, and William himself was famously private, reserved almost to the point of blankness, not the kind of man who warmed a room. Over time, they developed a genuine working partnership, but the union was always at its core a transaction, 2 Stuart-adjacent figures bolted together to solve a Protestant succession problem. What the marriage never produced was children. Mary suffered multiple miscarriages, and she died in December 1694 without a surviving heir, which meant the entire genetic and dynastic experiment of her marriage produced nothing forward into the family tree. Her death at 32 from smallpox was swift and devastating to the English court, and it accelerated the succession anxiety that would eventually produce the Act of Settlement in 1701, which rewired the entire British line of succession to exclude Catholics. Mary herself was a deeply religious woman, literate, thoughtful, and politically more capable than she is usually given credit for, often overshadowed in historical memory by the louder presence of her husband. Her inbreeding was mild. Her significance to this story is partly as a starting point, a baseline for what cousin marriage looked like when it was only 1 generation deep, before the compounding began. Queen Anne of Great Britain. Queen Anne sits just 1 step further along the same Stuart bloodline as her sister Mary, and her story transforms what was a quiet genetic footnote in Mary's case into something genuinely harrowing. Anne was the younger daughter of James II, born in 1665, and she married Prince George of Denmark in 1683, a match that brought in Scandinavian and North German Protestant royal blood that was itself the product of overlapping dynastic intermarriage across the Lutheran courts of Europe. The marriage was affectionate by royal standards, one of the more genuinely warm unions of the era, but what it produced biologically was catastrophic. Anne endured 17 pregnancies. 17. 12 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 4 children were born alive but died in infancy. 1 child, William, Duke of Gloucester, survived long enough to seem like he might be the answer to England's succession prayers, reaching the age of 11 before dying in 1700, probably from complications related to hydrocephalus. After William's death, Anne never successfully carried another pregnancy to term, and she ascended the throne in 1702 as the last Stuart monarch, fully aware that she would leave no heir behind her. Modern medical historians have proposed several retrospective explanations for her reproductive catastrophe. The most discussed is antiphospholipid syndrome, an autoimmune condition that causes the blood to clot abnormally and is a well-documented cause of recurrent miscarriage. This hypothesis, which should be understood as a retrospective medical speculation rather than a confirmed diagnosis, gained some traction from the pattern of Anne's losses, which were consistent with placental thrombosis. Whether a genetic predisposition to such a condition was moving through the Stuart line is a question that cannot be answered definitively with the evidence available, but the concentration of reproductive failure across the Stuart women of this generation is striking enough that geneticists and medical historians continue to examine it. By the end of her reign, Anne was physically broken, grossly obese, barely able to walk, suffering from severe gout that left her confined to a wheelchair-like chair and carried by attendants. Her portraits from the final years show a woman who looked decades older than she was, her body worn down by repeated pregnancy, repeated loss, and what was almost certainly chronic pain. She died on August 1st, 1714, age 49, and her death ended the Stuart dynasty entirely, triggering the Hanoverian succession that would reshape British royal identity for the next century. Anne is often treated as a footnote between the Glorious Revolution and the Georgian era, but her story is one of the most personally devastating in this entire list. A woman who wanted heirs, tried repeatedly to produce them, and was failed at every turn by a body that the accumulated pressures of dynastic inbreeding may have already compromised before she even began. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad, stands at the precise hinge point where this story turns from bad to catastrophic, because she is both a victim of royal inbreeding and the conduit through whom its worst consequences were transmitted forward into generations that would suffer far more than she did. Joanna was born in 1479, the third child of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and the problem starts right there, with her parents. Because Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins whose marriage required a papal dispensation to proceed. The two most powerful monarchs in Spain were already sharing a significant portion of their genetic ancestry before Joanna was conceived. She then married Philip I of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome, in 996, a match that brought in Habsburg blood for the first time. And it is this fusion, Trastamara meeting Habsburg, that set the machinery of one of history's greatest genetic disasters into motion. Joanna's mental state has been debated by historians for centuries. She was declared unfit to rule by her father Ferdinand after Philip's death in 1506, a declaration that conveniently allowed Ferdinand to continue governing Castile, and she was then imprisoned at the castle of Tordesillas by her own son Charles III from approximately 1509 onward, where she remained for roughly 46 years until her death in 1555. Whether Joanna was genuinely mentally ill, whether she suffered from something that would today be diagnosed as a mood disorder or psychotic condition with possible hereditary components, or whether she was a politically inconvenient woman whose sanity was strategically undermined by the men around her, is a question historians have not resolved. Some scholars argue she showed clear signs of what might now be called severe depression or bipolar disorder from early adulthood. Others point out that almost everything we know about her madness comes from sources with a direct interest in portraying her as unfit. What is not in dispute is that she was the mother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and that through Charles the genetic narrowing of the Habsburg line accelerated with each passing generation. Joanna lived to 75, outlasting almost everyone who had imprisoned her, and she died at Tordesillas on April 12, 1555, having spent nearly half a century in confinement. Her story is the pivot. Before Joanna, the inbreeding was present but manageable. After Joanna, and through the dynasty she founded with Philip, it would become something else entirely. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots is one of the most written about monarchs in European history. Her execution, her rivalry with Elizabeth the Fern, her romantic disasters. But what tends to get less attention is her role as a carrier and transmitter of the dense genetic legacy of the Tudor-Stuart network, a network in which cousin marriage had become so normalized that her marriage to her own first cousin barely registered as unusual at the time. Mary was born in December 1542, the daughter of James the Freitarts of Scotland and Mary of Guise, and her father was himself a grandson of Henry VII of England, placing her squarely inside the tight family web of Tudor and Stuart royalty. Her first marriage, to Francis II of France, connected her to the Valois dynasty, a French royal line with its own documented pattern of early deaths, physical fragility, and possible hereditary health conditions, and it produced no children before Francis died in 1560. Her second marriage, to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in July 1565, was the one that mattered genetically, because Darnley was her first cousin, the son of her father's sister, Margaret, and the union was close enough to raise eyebrows even in a court accustomed to consanguineous matches. Contemporary accounts describe Darnley as tall, physically striking, and deeply unstable, prone to erratic behavior and what observers called weakness of character, though whether any of this reflected inherited biological factors or simply personal failings is impossible to say with confidence. Their son, born in June 1566 and crowned James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, inherited a concentrated genetic package from both parents and through them from all the overlapping Tudor and Stuart lines behind them. James VI showed signs of physical weakness throughout his life, including what some historians have described as rickets-like symptoms in childhood, difficulty walking steadily, and a tongue reportedly too large for his mouth. And a contested but recurring theory among medical historians proposes that the Stuarts may have carried a genetic predisposition to acute intermittent porphyria, a hereditary metabolic disorder that can cause neurological and psychiatric symptoms. This theory is disputed and should not be treated as established fact, but it has been taken seriously enough to appear in peer-reviewed medical historical literature. Mary herself was executed on February 8, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, on the orders of Elizabeth I, and her death closed one chapter of her story, while the genetic thread she had woven through James continued forward into the next century and beyond. Catherine of Austria. Catherine of Austria was the daughter of Joanna of Castile and Philip the Serge, which means she entered the world already carrying the fused Trastamara-Habsburg genetic heritage at its first generation of combination, and the marriage that awaited her would fold that heritage back on itself with devastating results. Born on January 14th at the 1507, Catherine married John III of Portugal, and this was not simply a match between two royal houses. It was a double union, conducted simultaneously, with John's sister Isabella marrying Catherine's brother Charles V. A bilateral exchange of royals that crossed and recrossed the same family lines in a way that made the resulting genetic overlap between Catherine and John far greater than any simple dynastic label would suggest. They shared ancestry through multiple lines, and the children that resulted from this union bore the consequences. Catherine and John III had either 8 or 9 children together, sources differ slightly, and of those children only one, Maria Manuela, survived to adulthood. The others died in infancy or early childhood, a mortality rate so far above the already high baseline of 16th century child death that it demands an explanation beyond bad luck and poor medicine. Modern geneticists who have studied the Iberian Habsburg line have proposed that the accumulation of recessive lethal alleles, genes that in a single copy are harmless, but in the double copy produced by inbreeding become fatal, is the most coherent explanation for this pattern of infant and child death. Catherine would have watched her nursery empty out repeatedly, child after child dying before reaching an age where they could be educated or betrothed, or used in the dynastic games that gave royal children their only sanctioned purpose. Her surviving daughter Maria Manuela would marry Philip II of Spain and die at 18, and through that death Catherine became the grandmother of Don Carlos, one of the most notorious examples of inbreeding's physical and psychological consequences. Catherine served as regent of Portugal during her grandson Sebastian's minority, demonstrating real political ability in the management of a kingdom whose dynasty was quietly destroying itself from the inside. She died on February 12, 1578, having outlived nearly every child she had carried. Maria Manuela of Portugal. Maria Manuela of Portugal had the misfortune of being the sole survivor of Catherine of Austria's devastated nursery, the one child who made it through childhood, in a family where almost none did, and her survival brought her not safety, but a marriage that compressed the already extraordinary inbreeding of her lineage into something almost geometrically extreme. Born on October 15, 1527, Maria Manuela was the daughter of Catherine of Austria and John III of Portugal, two people who were already double cousins. She then married Philip II of Spain in 1543, and Philip was her first cousin on both sides simultaneously. Their shared ancestry ran through Joanna of Castile on both maternal and paternal lines, through Ferdinand and Isabella, through Philip I, creating a genetic loop with almost no external contribution from outside the same small group of interconnected ancestors. The inbreeding coefficient produced by this union was among the highest yet achieved by deliberate dynastic policy in European history. Maria Manuela was 16 when she married and 18 when she died, and she died on July 12, 1545, just 4 days after giving birth to a son who would be named Don Carlos. The likely cause of her death was postpartum hemorrhage, though the precise mechanism is not definitively documented, and some historians have speculated that underlying clotting disorders with hereditary components may have worsened her condition. Don Carlos, the child she died producing, grew into one of the most discussed examples of royal inbreeding's human cost, displaying severe physical abnormalities including a notably asymmetric body, a larger head than was typical, and behavioral instability so extreme that his own father eventually had him imprisoned, where he died in 1568 under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Maria Manuela herself is a figure who tends to disappear behind the more famous stories of Philip II and Don Carlos. But her death mattered structurally because it removed a genetic branch that might have introduced at least a marginal degree of variation, leaving Philip II free to compound the inbreeding further through his subsequent marriages, which he did repeatedly. Anna of Austria, Queen of Spain. Anna of Austria became the fourth wife of Philip II of Spain in 1570, and the fact that she was his niece, the daughter of his cousin and frequent correspondent, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II, required a special dispensation from Pope Pius V before the marriage could proceed. Even by Habsburg standards, the closeness of this match was notable. Anna had been born on November 1st, 1549, the daughter of Maximilian II and Maria of Austria, both of whom were Habsburgs, meaning she arrived at her marriage to Philip already carrying a high inbreeding coefficient entirely independent of his own, and the combination of the two pushed the resulting children into genetic territory that was, in retrospect, deeply dangerous. Anna had originally been betrothed to Philip's son Don Carlos, before Don Carlos's imprisonment and death removed him from the picture, after which she was redirected to the father instead, a reshuffling that illustrates with bleak clarity how purely transactional the Habsburg approach to marriage had become by this point. A woman could be moved from son to father like a chess piece, the specific relationship mattering far less than the maintenance of Habsburg to Habsburg connection. Anna and Philip had 5 children together, of whom only one, the future Philip III, survived to adulthood. The 4 who died did so in infancy or childhood, maintaining the grim pattern that had run through this dynasty's nurseries for generations. Anna herself died on October 26, 1580, age 30. Her death most likely a combination of influenza and the physical toll of repeated childbirth on a body that had been producing and losing children throughout her 20s. Philip III, the one survivor, was born in 1578 and would inherit not just the Spanish throne, but an inbreeding coefficient that was already among the highest in Europe, a starting point from which his own dynastic choices would push his children still further along the same trajectory. Anna of Austria is the clearest illustration of how the Habsburgs used the aunt-uncle-niece-nephew category of marriage, not as a shocking exception, but as a routine tool, generation after generation, treating the papal dispensation required as an administrative formality rather than a moral signal to stop. Margaret of Austria, Queen of Spain. Margaret of Austria was born on December 25, 1584, a princess of the Austrian Habsburg line, and her marriage to Philip III of Spain in 1599 continued the practice of connecting the Austrian and Spanish branches of the family that had been the cornerstone of Habsburg dynastic policy for most of the previous century. She and Philip III were second cousins by the simplest accounting of their relationship, but given the layers of intermarriage that had taken place across every preceding generation, the actual genetic overlap between them was substantially greater than that label suggests. A family tree that should spread outward with each generation instead kept looping back to the same small cluster of ancestors, and Margaret and Philip were another knot in that loop. What their marriage produced, reproductively speaking, was relentless. Margaret gave birth to 8 children in 11 years, a pace that by itself would have been physically punishing for any woman, and it proved fatal. She died on October 3, 1611, age 26, following complications from the birth of her last child. 8 children, 11 years, dead at 26. Among those children was the future Philip of the Fierce, born in 1605, who would grow up to become the father of Charles II of Spain. The figure at the end of this story, whose name has become almost synonymous with the consequences of everything this dynasty had been doing to itself for a century and a half. And Margaret was, by the accounts of those who knew her, an intelligent and pious woman with genuine political interests, someone who engaged with the governance of the empire she had married into rather than retreating entirely into domestic life. She was also functionally a reproductive instrument of dynastic policy, her body deployed in service of an heir-producing project that killed her before she reached her late 20s. Philip IV grew up without her, raised in the rigid and increasingly airless culture of the late Habsburg court, shaped by an environment that had been narrowing genetically and culturally for generations. The line between Margaret and Charles II runs straight through Philip IV, and every link in that chain was forged by the same deliberate inbreeding that Margaret herself was both a product and a producer of. Mariana of Austria, Queen of Spain. Mariana of Austria was born on December 22, 1634, a daughter of the Austrian Habsburg line, and her path to becoming Queen of Spain followed one of the more disquieting detours in royal matrimonial history. She had originally been intended to marry Balthazar Carlos, the son of Philip IV of Spain, a match that would have been a standard continuation of the Austria-Spain dynastic linkage. When Balthazar Carlos died unexpectedly in 1646, the Spanish court did not look outward for a replacement match. It looked inward. Mariana was redirected to marry Philip IV himself, her intended husband's father and her own uncle, a union requiring the now routine papal dispensation that Habsburg matrimonial policy seemed to generate with industrial regularity. She was 14 at the time of the betrothal. Philip was 41. They married in 1649. The marriage produced several children, of whom the one who survived to adulthood and to the throne was Charles, born November 6, 1661, the child who would become Charles II of Spain. The genetic contribution Mariana made to Charles was catastrophic, not because of anything unusual about her as an individual, but because she was herself the product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage in the Austrian line, meaning that when her genes combined with Philip IV's, which carried the equally inbred Spanish Habsburg heritage, the result was a child whose ancestry had been compressed and folded back on itself to a degree that had no real precedent in documented history. After Philip IV's death in 1665, Mariana served as regent for the young Charles II, and she was a more capable political operator than she is usually given credit for. She navigated factional court conflicts with real skill, managed the weight of governing a global empire through a period of military and economic decline, and survived attempts by court rivals to exile her from power, which they eventually succeeded in doing temporarily before she partially recovered her influence. She lived until May 16, 1696, long enough to watch her son's reign become the embodiment of dynastic collapse, and she died knowing that the genetic consequences of everything her family had deliberately chosen across 5 generations were fully visible in the man sitting on the Spanish throne, Charles II's queens, and the end of a dynasty. The 2 women who married Charles II of Spain, Marie Louise of Orleans and Maria Anna of Neuburg, were the final queens of the Spanish Habsburg line, and the story of their marriages is really the story of what happens when the cumulative weight of generations of deliberate inbreeding produces a human being who is biologically incapable of continuing the dynasty that created him. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient has been calculated at approximately 0.2 Pharaoh, a figure produced by geneticists at the University of Santiago de Compostela in a 2009 study published in the journal PLOS ONE, authored by Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero. To understand what 0.254 means in concrete terms, a child born to 2 full siblings would have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Charles II, the product of uncle-niece marriage layered on top of generations of cousin and double cousin marriages, was genetically almost equivalent to the offspring of a sibling union, except that his parents were not siblings. They were simply the endpoint of a dynasty that had been recycling its own genes for so long that the distinction had almost ceased to matter. 16 of his 32 great-great-great-grandparents were the same individual. Every branch of his family tree that should have diverged outward into different bloodlines instead looped back to the same small group of ancestors, most of them traceable to Joanna of Castile and Philip Istafir, the couple at item 3 of this video, who set the whole process in motion. The physical consequences were extensive and well documented. Charles could not chew solid food properly because the Habsburg jaw, a prognathism that ran through the family but in him reached its most extreme expression, left his lower jaw so prominent that his teeth did not meet. Contemporary accounts describe him as drooling frequently because his tongue was reportedly too large for his mouth to contain comfortably. He was unable to walk steadily in childhood and was delayed in nearly every developmental milestone. He suffered from what a 2009 medical retrospective proposed may have been a combination of pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, conditions that together would explain his short stature, physical weakness, cognitive difficulties, and infertility, though this analysis is a retrospective hypothesis and not a confirmed diagnosis. He was expected to die as an infant and was treated as a perpetual invalid by the court around him, yet he survived to the age of 38. Marie-Louise of Orleans, born in 1662, was the first woman brought in to try to produce an heir from this biological circumstance. She was a French princess, a granddaughter of Louis XV, and she arrived in Madrid in 1679 at the age of 17 to find a court that was rigidly ceremonious, stifling in its formality, and centered on a husband whose physical condition she found, by all accounts, deeply distressing. Contemporary letters and diplomatic reports describe her as miserable in Madrid, missing the lighter culture of the French court, trapped in a marriage that was personally repellent and dynastically feudal. She died on February 12, 1689, aged 26, without having produced a child, and the circumstances of her death generated rumors of poisoning that have never been substantiated and should be treated as unverified. Maria Anna of Neuburg, born in 1677, became Charles's second wife later that same year. Another attempt to solve the infertility problem by changing the woman rather than acknowledging that the problem was structural and irreversible. Maria Anna was also unable to conceive with Charles, confirming what the medical reality of his condition had made almost certain, and she outlived him by 4 decades, dying in 1740 having spent 40 years as the widow of the most biologically compromised monarch in documented European history. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700 without an heir, and his death immediately triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that drew in every major European power and ultimately reshaped the continent's political geography. The Spanish Habsburg line was extinct. The dynasty that Ferdinand and Isabella had built, that Joanna of Castile had transmitted to the Habsburgs, that Charles V had expanded into a global empire, that Philip II had governed at its height, and that 6 generations of deliberate consanguineous marriage had slowly hollowed out from the inside, ended with a man who could not chew his food, could not produce an heir, and could not walk across a room without difficulty. The consequences of that ending, the war it caused, the treaties it produced, the way it redistributed European power, were geopolitically significant enough that the inbreeding of the Spanish Habsburg line might be the single most consequential act of dynastic self-destruction in the history of organized states. Cleopatra II of Egypt. Cleopatra II was born around 185 BC into a dynasty that had already been folding in on itself for generations, and by the time she arrived, the Ptolemaic royal family of Egypt had been practicing sibling marriage so consistently that calling it a tradition would be an understatement. It was closer to policy. Her parents were Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I, both of Macedonian Greek descent, continuing a lineage that had deliberately closed its doors to outside blood ever since Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe II back in the 270s BC, setting the template every subsequent ruler would follow. When Cleopatra VI came of age, she married her brother Ptolemy VI, which was not considered scandalous within the dynasty but was simply the expected thing, the logical continuation of a system designed to keep power, titles, and inheritance from ever escaping the family. Together they ruled Egypt in an uneasy co-regency that also included their younger brother Ptolemy VIII, a man whose cruelty would come to define this entire chapter of Ptolemaic history. When Ptolemy VI died in 145 BC, Cleopatra II did not escape the cycle. She married Ptolemy VIII instead, making her a wife to 2 consecutive brothers, a detail that reads almost impossibly tangled until you remember that this was the intended design of the dynasty from the start. Ptolemy I, however, was not content with simply marrying his brother's widow. He also married Cleopatra VI's own daughter from her first marriage, Cleopatra III, simultaneously, meaning he was husband to both a mother and her daughter at the same time, and that daughter was also his own niece. This 3-generation knot grandmother, mother, and daughter all bound into the same male bloodline within a single reign, represented the Ptolemaic system operating at its most extreme. The consequences were not merely genetic. Ptolemy the Fourth exiled Cleopatra from Egypt entirely, and when she attempted to reassert her claim, he responded by murdering her son Memphites, the child she had borne him, cutting the body into pieces, and reportedly sending those dismembered remains to her as a birthday gift, an act so grotesque it shocked even ancient commentators who were not easily shocked. She eventually returned to Egypt and was reconciled politically with both Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra III in a triple co-regency. 3 people bound by blood, marriage, and mutual hatred ruling a kingdom together until Ptolemy VIII died in 116 BC. What Cleopatra II's story illustrates is something the Ptolemaic dynasty kept demonstrating across centuries. The genetic closeness that was meant to consolidate divine power and prevent the dilution of the bloodline instead produced a court where the people most likely to destroy you were the people you were most closely related to. Because in a system where only family members were permitted to hold power, rivals and siblings became the same category of person. Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Cleopatra VII, born around 69 BC, is the most famous woman in the ancient world, and also the final product of one of history's longest-running experiments in deliberate inbreeding, a dynasty that had been systematically marrying brothers to sisters for roughly 200 years by the time she was born. By her generation, geneticists and historians who have studied the Ptolemaic family tree estimate that her inbreeding coefficient, the statistical measure of how much of her genome was identical by descent from shared ancestors, was comparable to that of a child produced by a union between close relatives. The cumulative arithmetic of generation after generation of sibling marriage finally arriving at a single person. Her mother's identity remains one of antiquity's genuine mysteries. The historical record does not confirm who she was, with some scholars suggesting she may have been a concubine rather than a royal sibling wife, which would have introduced a small degree of outside genetic variation, though not enough to meaningfully alter the dynastic picture. Her father was Ptolemy IV, himself the product of generations of the same closed system. She married both of her younger brothers consecutively, first Ptolemy III and then Ptolemy XIV, as Ptolemaic custom demanded, though she appears to have had no genuine political or romantic investment in either marriage. Her actual alliances were with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, both Romans, both entirely outside the dynasty's genetic bubble. What makes Cleopatra particularly striking in the context of her bloodline is that she was, by every historical account, formidably intelligent. Plutarch records that she spoke 9 languages, including Egyptian, which no Ptolemaic ruler before her had bothered to learn, as well as Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Syriac, Median, and Parthian, alongside her native Greek. She was a skilled naval strategist, a sharp political operator who managed to remain relevant to 2 of Rome's most powerful men in succession, and a ruler who held her throne against considerable opposition for 2 decades. She is simultaneously the most famous argument for and against the idea that inbreeding inevitably destroys cognitive capacity. Her dynasty's genetics were among the most concentrated in recorded history, and yet she was one of antiquity's most capable rulers. Her children with Mark Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene II, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus, represent the final biological branch of the Ptolemaic line, exported outward just as the dynasty itself collapsed under Roman conquest. She died on August 12, 30th BC, most likely by her own hand, as Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, ending not just a reign, but the 2-century genetic experiment her ancestors had constructed. Cleopatra Selene II. Cleopatra Selene II was born in 40 BC as the twin daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, which made her simultaneously the last generation of concentrated Ptolemaic genetics and the first member of that lineage to be permanently removed from Egypt. Her mother already carried the compounded inbreeding of 7+ Ptolemaic generations, and while her father Antony's Roman blood introduced some degree of genetic variation, Selene entered the world already carrying a significant inherited coefficient from her mother's side alone. The first decade of her life was defined by catastrophe. Her parents' suicides in 30 BC, the Roman conquest of Egypt, and her appearance in chains, golden chains, according to ancient accounts, in a concession to her royal status, in Octavian's triumph parade through Rome, displayed as a living symbol of a defeated and absorbed civilization. Her twin brother Alexander Helios disappears from the historical record after this point, his fate unknown, which itself says something about how Rome treated the children of its defeated enemies. Selene, however, survived. Octavian eventually married her to Jubutu of Mauritania, a Numidian prince who had been raised in Rome and was loyal to Roman interests, and she became Queen of Mauritania in what is now roughly modern Morocco and western Algeria. The marriage introduced fresh genetic material from an entirely different lineage, and their reign together is considered by historians to have been culturally productive. They maintained a court that blended Hellenistic, Roman, and North African influences, minted coins bearing both their portraits, and kept Mauritania stable as a client kingdom of Rome. Her son Ptolemy of Mauritania inherited the kingdom and was later summoned to Rome by the Emperor Caligula, who had him executed in approximately 40 AD. The reason for which ancient sources do not clearly agree upon, though some suggest Ptolemy's purple cloak at a gladiatorial spectacle provoked Caligula's jealousy. With Ptolemy's death, the last surviving branch of the Ptolemaic bloodline was extinguished entirely. Cleopatra Selene II died around 6 BC, her exact death date uncertain, and she occupies a specific and melancholy place in this story, the last woman born of the fully inbred Ptolemaic core, carried out of Egypt in chains, transplanted to the North African coast, and ultimately the grandmother of a dynasty's final extinction. Blanche of Bourbon. Blanche of Bourbon was born around 1339 into the French royal nobility, the daughter of Peter I, Duke of Bourbon, and Isabella of Valois, and she arrived into a European aristocratic system that had been quietly accumulating inbreeding through cousin marriages for so many consecutive generations that no single union looked dramatic enough to attract comment, even as the genetic overlap compounded steadily beneath the surface. Her inbreeding did not come from one shocking sibling marriage as in the Ptolemaic case, but from the slow, relentless logic of medieval dynastic politics, in which the pool of acceptable marriage partners was limited to other royal and high noble houses. Those houses kept intermarrying with each other across generations, and the result was a network of Capetian and Iberian bloodlines so thoroughly interwoven that calculating any individual's precise inbreeding coefficient requires untangling genealogical charts that loop back on themselves repeatedly. She was betrothed to Peter I of Castile, known to history as either Peter the Just or Peter the Cruel, depending on which faction of medieval Castilian politics you consult, and they married on June 3, 1353, in Valladolid. The marriage lasted, in any meaningful sense, approximately 3 days. Peter abandoned Blanche almost immediately after the wedding to return to his mistress Maria de Padilla, a woman he appears to have genuinely loved and with whom he had already fathered children, and Blanche was imprisoned, first in Toledo and later most likely at the castle of Jerez de la Frontera, spending the remaining 8 years of her life in confinement. She was approximately 22 years old when she died in 1361, the exact manner of her death disputed by sources. Some medieval chroniclers report she was strangled, others suggest poison, but the consensus is that Peter ordered her killed, removing a political inconvenience he had never wanted in the first place. She produced no surviving heirs, meaning her genetic line simply terminated in a prison cell, the endpoint of a life that had been entirely shaped by dynastic calculation from birth to death. Her fate was considered so unjust, even by the standards of a brutal century, that she became a martyr figure across Europe, her story appearing in literature for generations afterward, including works in the tradition of Lope de Vega. She is the clearest illustration of what happened to women in inbred dynastic systems when the political purpose they were designed to serve, alliance, inheritance, genetic consolidation, was overridden by a king who simply did not want them. Joanna of Castile. Joanna of Castile, born November 6, 1479, is known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, a title applied to her by the men who imprisoned her, and which history has been slowly, carefully revising ever since. She was the daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, a marriage that itself required a papal dispensation because the two were second cousins. A formal acknowledgement written into the documents of the union that yes, these people shared blood close enough to require special permission from Rome to wed. This made Joanna a product of the sorely tightening Iberian noble bloodline, but the more significant genetic event in her story was her marriage in 1496 to Philip I of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome, who brought with him the full weight of Habsburg dynastic genetics, a lineage that had been practicing uncle-niece and first-cousin marriages across its own branches for generations, accumulating recessive traits. at a rate that would eventually produce some of the most visibly affected individuals in European royal history. Joanna's son with Philip became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers of the 16th century, and a man whose own inbreeding coefficient marked him as a critical link in the Habsburg chain of compounding endogamy. Joanna herself appears to have been a woman of genuine intelligence who was systematically denied any opportunity to exercise it. After Philip died in 1506, her grief was intense and prolonged enough that her father Ferdinand used it as justification to have her declared mentally incompetent and confined to the castle of Tordesillas, where she would remain for the next 46 years, first under her father's authority and then under her son Charles's. Whether her mental state reflected genuine psychological illness, a grief response that was weaponized for political convenience, possible neurological effects of her genetic background, or simply the predictable consequences of being imprisoned for half a century, is a question historians including Bethany Aram have spent considerable effort untangling. The answer is probably some combination of all of these, in proportions that can no longer be fully separated. She died on April 12, 1555, at Tordesillas, having spent the last 46 years of a 75-year life confined by men who found her easier to manage as a madwoman than as a queen. She is one of history's most precise examples of a woman whose body was used as a vehicle for dynastic genetic transmission, and whose mind was then used as the excuse for taking everything else away. Mary I of England. Mary I of England, born February 18, 1516, was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and through her mother's line she inherited the compounded genetic legacy of the Spanish royal family. Because Catherine of Aragon's parents were Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella the Frisker of Castile, the same second cousin couple who produced Joanna of Castile, meaning that the inbreeding Catherine carried from her own parents was now passed forward into Mary. Henry VIII and Catherine were not closely related to each other, which introduced some genetic variation, but Catherine's pre-existing inbreeding coefficient traveled intact into their daughter. Mary's childhood was one of sustained psychological assault. Her parents' marriage was annulled when she was 17. Her own legitimacy was stripped from her by Act of Parliament. She was removed from court, separated from her mother, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, a calculated humiliation designed to break her. She eventually came to the throne in July 1553, the first queen regnant of England, and immediately became famous for the burning of approximately 283 to 290 Protestant martyrs at Smithfield and other sites across England, a campaign of religious persecution that earned her the name Bloody Mary, and has defined her reputation ever since. Her personal life, however, was a medical tragedy that has received considerably less attention. She married Philip II of Spain in 1554, her first cousin once removed, adding yet another layer of dynastic entanglement, and experienced at least 2 episodes of what is now understood to have been pseudocysis, false pregnancy, in which her abdomen swelled, her menstrual cycle ceased, and the court prepared for an heir that never arrived. Medical historians have proposed various explanations for these episodes, including hormonal disruption, uterine tumors, and psychological factors. And while directly attributing pseudocysis to inbreeding requires caution and is speculative, the broader pattern of her reproductive failure, combined with the immune and hormonal irregularities that can accompany high inbreeding coefficients, has drawn scholarly attention. She died on November 17, 1558, at 42 years old, having produced no surviving heirs despite 2 apparent pregnancies, and the throne passed to Elizabeth. She is a figure whose reign has been almost entirely defined by what she did to others, while what was done to her, genetically, politically, personally, has been largely treated as footnote. Maria Theresa of Spain. Maria Theresa of Spain, born September 10, 1638, was a Spanish infanta who became Queen of France as the wife of Louis XIV, and she arrived at the French court carrying one of the highest calculated inbreeding coefficients in European royal history. Estimated by modern genealogical analysis, including work published by Alvarez and colleagues in 2009, at approximately 0.254, meaning roughly 1/4 of her entire genome was identical by descent. A level of genetic concentration comparable to what you would expect from the child of a half-sibling union. Her parents were Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France, but Philip III's own parents were Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, who were themselves first cousins. And this pattern of first cousin and uncle-niece marriages, repeated across the preceding Habsburg generations, meant that by the time Maria Theresa was born, the Spanish Habsburg line had been accumulating homozygous genetic segments for over a century of deliberate endogamy. The visual evidence of this accumulation was written clearly across her face: the prominent lower jaw, the thickened lips, the slightly protruding bite that historians call the Habsburg jaw, or Habsburg lip, caused by the repeated expression of a recessive developmental trait when both parents consistently carry the same allele, generation after generation, until it appears in nearly every member of the family. She married Louis XIV on June 9, 1660, in a union that was also a cousin marriage. She was Louis's first cousin, meaning the French court was not so much diluting the Habsburg genetics as absorbing them into a slightly wider pool. Of the 6 children she bore Louis XIV, only one, the Grand Dauphin, survived infancy. 5 children died young, a rate of infant mortality that was catastrophic even by 17th century standards, when child mortality was already high, and which has been attributed in part to the expression of recessive lethal alleles in children whose parents shared so much of their genetic material. She died on July 30th, 1683, at 44 years old, reportedly in good health until a relatively rapid decline, and Louis XIV's comment on her death, that she had never caused him trouble except by dying, is one of history's more efficient summaries of how little the inner life of an inbred dynastic wife was expected to matter. Maria Anna of Austria. Maria Anna of Austria, born December 23, 1634, occupies a position near the absolute center of the Spanish Habsburg genetic collapse, not merely as a participant in the system, but as one of its most extreme individual products. Her parents were Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III and his wife Maria Anna of Spain, and that marriage was between uncle and niece, Ferdinand being the uncle of his own bride, one of the most genetically concentrated, single-generation unions in the documented European royal record. This means that Maria Anna was born from a union closer than first cousins, with an inbreeding coefficient from her parents' relationship alone that would be significant even without the generations of prior Habsburg endogamy stacked beneath it. She was subsequently married into the Spanish Habsburg branch, wedding Philip IV of Spain, who was her great-uncle on her mother's side, further collapsing whatever genealogical distance remained between the Austrian and Spanish branches of the family. The son produced by this union was Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, who became the most visibly and severely affected individual in the documented history of European royal inbreeding. Charles II could not chew his own food because his jaw was so malformed. He reportedly could not speak clearly until the age of 4. He suffered from chronic illness, possible hormonal disorders, and what contemporaries described as severe cognitive difficulties. He died in 1700 at the age of 38, without producing an heir, ending the entire Spanish Habsburg dynasty in a single generation. Modern analysis published by Alvarez and colleagues in 2009 calculated Charles II's inbreeding coefficient at approximately 0.24, nearly identical to the product of a sibling union, and traced the accumulation backward through 9 generations of deliberate endogamy, with Maria Anna as the final maternal link in that chain. She was both the victim of the system and the woman through whom its most catastrophic consequence was transmitted. She survived her son, dying on May 16, 1696, 4 years before Charles II ended the dynasty she had been born, raised, and married entirely in service of. Alexandra Feodorovna, born Alex of Hesse on June 6, 1872, represents a different kind of inbreeding story from the Ptolemaic or Habsburg models, not one concentrated into a single family line over centuries, but one distributed across the entire network of European royal houses that had become, by the late 19th century, so thoroughly interconnected through Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren that they function genetically as a single extended family. Victoria herself appears to have carried a spontaneous mutation for hemophilia B, a blood clotting disorder in which the absence of clotting factor makes even minor injuries potentially life-threatening. And she passed this mutation through her daughters across multiple European thrones, to Spain through Beatrice, to Prussia and Russia through Alice and Alex respectively. The European royal cousin marriage network meant that this single mutation, introduced at one point, could travel through the interconnected bloodlines with disturbing efficiency. Alexandra married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia on November 26, 1894. Nicholas was her first cousin once removed, entirely typical for a royal marriage of the era, and together they had 5 children, 4 daughters, and a son. The son, Alexei Nikolaevich, born August 12, 1904, inherited hemophilia B from his mother, confirmed with scientific certainty by DNA analysis conducted in 2009 by Rogaev and colleagues on remains recovered from the Romanov burial site. Hemophilia B meant that any bruise, any minor internal bleed, any small wound could become a crisis, and Alexei's childhood was defined by episodes of agonizing hemorrhaging into his joints that left him temporarily crippled and in severe pain. Alexandra's desperation around her son's condition made her increasingly dependent on Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose ability to calm Alexei during these episodes, possibly through hypnosis reducing anxiety-driven bleeding responses, though the exact mechanism is still debated, gave him an influence over the imperial family that became politically catastrophic. The spectacle of the Empress of Russia, enthralled by a wandering mystic, combined with the family's withdrawal from public life and Alexander's increasingly erratic intervention in state affairs, contributed to the perception of the Romanov court as incompetent and out of touch in the years leading up to the 1917 revolution. Alexandra, Nicholas, and all 5 of their children were executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg on July 17, 1918, by Bolshevik forces, the endpoint of a chain that runs from Victorian cousin marriages through a genetic mutation carried in X chromosomes across European thrones, to a boy's bruised limbs, a mother's panic, a mystic's calm voice, and a dynasty's collapse. Her inbreeding coefficient was moderate by Habsburg standards, but the specific mutation her bloodline carried forward remade the political landscape of the 20th century in ways that no amount of accumulated Habsburg jaw ever quite managed. The Ptolemaic dynasty. When Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy seized Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BC, he founded a royal line that would rule for nearly 3 centuries, and spend most of that time marrying itself. The Ptolemaic dynasty practiced deliberate sibling marriage not out of desperation or ignorance, but as a calculated religious and political strategy. By mirroring the divine marriage of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, who were themselves brother and sister, the Ptolemies positioned themselves as living deities rather than mere foreign conquerors. It kept the money in the family. It kept the throne in the family. And over roughly 275 years, and at least 7 to 8 generations of documented close kin unions, it also kept the genetic damage in the family. Cleopatra II married her brother Ptolemy VIII. Cleopatra III then married that same man, her own uncle, after her mother. Ptolemy IV married his sister Arsinoe III. The pattern repeated so consistently that historians studying the dynasty's genealogical records describe it less as a family tree, and more as a tangled loop. The physical and cognitive consequences of this kind of sustained inbreeding, facial asymmetry, immune dysfunction, reduced fertility, and neurological instability, are well established in modern genetics, though specific skeletal or documentary evidence confirming deformities in individual Ptolemaic rulers remains limited given the state of surviving records. What is documented is a dynasty marked by extraordinary fratricidal violence, erratic decision-making, and a bloodline that grew progressively less stable over time. The most famous Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, was actually one of the least inbred of the entire line, a fact that some historians argue directly explains her unusual political sharpness, her fluency in 9 languages, and her capacity to outmaneuver much of the Roman world. The dynasty ended not with a military defeat, but with Cleopatra VII's suicide in 30 BC, after which Egypt passed to Rome. 3 centuries of deliberate genetic narrowing, and the last ruler standing was the one who happened to carry the least of it, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Rome's first imperial dynasty lasted roughly 96 years, from Augustus to Nero, and across that span, it produced some of the most documented cases of physical disability and behavioral dysfunction in ancient history, much of it recorded in unflattering detail by Suetonius in his work, The 12 Caesars. Augustus himself engineered a web of cousin and close relative marriages specifically designed to concentrate power and dynastic legitimacy within his bloodline, a political calculation that had predictable biological consequences across just a few generations. The most physically documented case is Claudius, the 4th emperor, whose condition Suetonius describes with almost clinical specificity, a pronounced limp that made him stumble when he walked, a severe stammer that made public speaking an ordeal, a tremor of the head and hands that worsened under stress, and a tendency to drool, particularly when laughing or angry. Ancient sources, including Augustus himself, in surviving letters describe Claudius as appearing mentally deficient, and he was largely excluded from public life for decades before accidentally becoming emperor when the Praetorian Guard found him hiding behind a curtain after Caligula's assassination. Modern medical historians have proposed explanations ranging from cerebral palsy to Tourette syndrome to the after effects of a serious childhood illness, though no definitive diagnosis is possible. His son Britannicus reportedly suffered from epilepsy. Caligula, who preceded Claudius, displayed behavior so extreme, claiming to be a living god, conducting military campaigns against the sea, reportedly appointing his horse to the Senate, that ancient and modern writers alike have speculated about temporal lobe epilepsy, encephalitis from a serious illness in his first year of rule, or simply the unraveling effect of absolute power on an already unstable personality. The line ended with Nero, who ordered the murders of his own mother, his first wife, and his tutor, and who showed a pattern of paranoia and emotional volatility consistent with severe psychological inheritance. The Julio-Claudians were not the most inbred dynasty in history, but they demonstrated with remarkable efficiency how quickly a concentrated bloodline begins to fray at the edges. The Habsburg dynasty, early period. No royal family in history is more synonymous with inbreeding and its physical consequences than the Habsburgs, and the early period of their dominance, stretching from roughly 1438 through the late 1600s, established the genetic foundation for what became one of the most extraordinary slow-motion biological disasters ever recorded in a ruling family. The Habsburgs controlled Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and significant portions of the Americas, and they maintained this power partly through military force, partly through bureaucratic genius, and partly through an absolute refusal to let titles or wealth leave the family through marriage to outsiders. The result was a dynasty that folded back on itself genealogically with such regularity that by the time the Spanish line ended in 1700, its last ruler was more inbred than a child produced by a sibling pairing. The physical marker most associated with the Habsburgs is mandibular prognathism, what became known colloquially as the Habsburg jaw. An abnormally protruding lower jaw that in its milder forms caused a distinctive heavy-chinned appearance, and in its severe forms made chewing nearly impossible and speech difficult to understand. A 2019 study published in the Annals of Human Biology analyzed 66 portraits of Habsburg rulers spanning 15 generations, cross-referenced with detailed genealogical data, and found a direct statistical correlation between the degree of inbreeding and the severity of the jaw deformity. The more closely related a ruler's parents, the more pronounced the physical presentation. Across the dynasty's documented history, conditions including epilepsy, intellectual disability, severe gout, chronic dropsy, and extraordinarily high infant mortality rates appear with a frequency far above what random chance or the era's general conditions would explain. Many of the dynasty's heirs died before reaching adulthood, not from wars or accidents, but from what read today like congenital fragility. The early Habsburg rulers were building a genetic debt that their descendants would be forced to pay with their bodies. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain, known to his contemporaries as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was the final and most catastrophic product of the Habsburg breeding program, and his life reads less like a biography than like a clinical case study in what happens when a royal line inbreeds across enough generations without interruption. Born on November 6, 1661, Charles could not walk till he was 8 years old and did not speak until he was 4. His jaw was so severely deformed that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, making it impossible for him to chew food properly. Courtiers reportedly had to prepare his meals to a near liquid consistency. His tongue was oversized, causing him to drool visibly, and making his speech difficult to understand even to those accustomed to him. His inbreeding coefficient, a mathematical measure of genetic overlap between parents, has been calculated by researchers at approximately 0.24, which is higher than the theoretical coefficient for the child of a brother and sister pairing at 0.25. This was not the result of one generation of poor decision-making. It was the product of at least 9 generations of deliberate cousin, uncle-niece, and sibling-adjacent marriages, stacked one on top of another, with Charles's mother also being his first cousin once removed, and his great-niece through a separate line of descent. He was entirely infertile across 2 marriages, which meant that despite ruling the largest empire in the world, he could not produce an heir. His death in 1700 at age 38 triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped European borders and involved nearly every major power on the continent. A report attributed to the French ambassador described his autopsy as revealing a body entirely ravaged, though historians note that such accounts were sometimes exaggerated for political purposes. What is not in dispute is that Charles II of Spain represents the most extreme documented case of inbreeding-related physical deformity in any ruling monarch in recorded European history. The Trastamara dynasty. The Habsburgs did not emerge from nowhere. The dynasty that preceded them in Spain, the Trastamaras, established both the genetic and political patterns that the Habsburgs then accelerated to their logical extreme. The Trastamara line ruled Castile and Aragon through the 15th century, and it produced two figures whose conditions stand as some of the most dramatic examples of hereditary dysfunction in medieval royalty. Henry IV of Castile, who reigned from 1454 to 1474, was known to his contemporaries as Henry the Impotent, a nickname that was both politically weaponized and apparently medically accurate. Despite two marriages, Henry failed to produce a universally accepted legitimate heir, and contemporary accounts describe physical characteristics that modern historians have interpreted as potentially indicating an intersex condition or severe hormonal disorder, though definitive diagnosis across 5 centuries is impossible. The succession crisis his condition created destabilized the Iberian Peninsula for decades. His eventual successor, his half-sister Isabella, the famous Isabella of Castile, produced a daughter, Juana, whose story is among the most debated in Spanish royal history. Juana, later called Juana la Loca or Joanna the Mad, is documented as having suffered a complete psychological breakdown following the death of her husband, Philip the Handsome, in 1506. She reportedly refused to allow his coffin to be sealed, traveling with it across Spain, and allegedly having it opened periodically to view the body. Her father, Ferdinand, subsequently had her imprisoned in the castle of Tordesillas, where she remained confined for approximately 46 years until her death in 1555. Modern historians are genuinely divided on whether Juana suffered from what we would today recognize as severe grief psychosis or schizophrenia, or whether her confinement was primarily a political maneuver by the men around her who wanted her out of the way. What is not disputed is that her grandmother, Isabel of Portugal, suffered from a similarly severe and documented mental illness, which places Juana within a clear hereditary pattern. The Trastamara dysfunction fed directly into the Habsburg genetics through Juana's son Charles I of Spain, who became Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, completing the pipeline from one dynasty's inherited vulnerabilities to another's amplified catastrophe. The Romanov dynasty, Alexei Romanov. When Tsarevich Alexei Romanov was born on August 12, 1904, his birth was celebrated across the Russian Empire as the long-awaited arrival of a male heir to the throne. Within weeks, that celebration curdled into quiet terror as his parents realized that their son was bleeding in ways that would not stop. Alexei suffered from hemophilia B, a genetic disorder caused by a mutation in the factor IX gene that prevents blood from clotting normally, meaning that internal bleeding from even minor injuries could continue unchecked for hours or days, causing excruciating pain, joint damage, and potentially death. The condition was confirmed with certainty by DNA analysis of the Romanov remains recovered after the Soviet era, with results published in 2009. The mutation came through his mother, Tsarina Alexandra, who was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Britain and carried the altered gene without being affected by it herself, as female carriers typically are not. The political consequences of Alexei's condition were staggering. His parents, and particularly his mother, kept his illness a closely guarded state secret, partly out of dynastic pride and partly out of genuine fear that revealing the heir's fragility would destabilize the empire. This secrecy created a vacuum that Grigory Rasputin filled with remarkable effectiveness. The wandering mystic from Siberia demonstrated an apparent ability to calm Alexei during bleeding episodes, which historians now largely attribute to his insistence that attendants stop administering aspirin, a medication that dramatically worsens bleeding, combined with the genuine physiological effect of reduced anxiety on blood flow. Whatever the mechanism, Rasputin's influence over Alexei gave him extraordinary access to the Tsar and Tsarina, warping court politics, alienating the Russian nobility, and contributing directly to the atmosphere of dysfunction and isolation that surrounded the royal family in the years before the 1917 revolution. Alexei Romanov died on July 17, 1918, at Yekaterinburg, executed alongside his family at age 13. A single inherited genetic mutation, passed through the most celebrated royal bloodline in Europe, contributed to the fall of a 300-year dynasty. The Spanish Habsburg line, Philip II to Philip IV. One of the most visually documented progressions of inbreeding-related physical deterioration in history can be traced across just 3 successive Spanish monarchs, Philip II, Philip III, and Philip IV, whose reigns spanned from 1556 to 1665, and whose portraits, many painted by the greatest artists of the era, show the Habsburg jaw and its associated conditions growing more severe with each generation. Philip II, who reigned from 1556 to 1598, had a pronounced jaw and in his later years developed gout so debilitating that his hands and feet swelled to the point where he could barely move. Contemporary accounts describe his final months as spent in bed, his body covered in sores, unable to tolerate clothing on his skin. He managed to produce a surviving heir, but 4 of his children from various marriages died young. Philip III, who reigned from 1598 to 1621, was physically weak, and by the accounts of those who served him, so intellectually passive that he delegated virtually all governance to a series of royal favorites called validos, essentially outsourcing the running of the largest empire on earth, because the king himself lacked either the capacity or the will to govern. Philip IV, the third of this sequence, reigned from 1621 to 1665 and was painted repeatedly by Diego Velázquez across roughly 3 decades, producing a visual record of physical deterioration across a single reign. The jaw in Velázquez's later portraits of Philip IV is unmistakable, elongated, jutting, the lower lip prominent and heavy. Philip IV fathered more than a dozen illegitimate children, suggesting fertility was not his problem, but his legitimate heirs died at a catastrophic rate. Several in infancy, others in early childhood, others from illness and adolescence. The one legitimate son who survived long enough to inherit the throne was Charles II, whose story has already been told. The Philip lineage represents an almost laboratory-quality demonstration of what compounding inbreeding looks like in real time across 3 human generations, documented not in medical records but in oil paint. The Medici family. The Medicis of Florence were not a royal family in the strict dynastic sense for most of their history. They were bankers who became rulers, patrons who became princes, and eventually a clan who produced 2 queens of France. But their documented physical legacy, confirmed by modern forensic analysis of their actual skeletal remains, earns them a place in any serious examination of hereditary and environmental deformity among Europe's ruling class. A study analyzing the remains of Medici children interred in the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence found evidence of rickets, a vitamin D deficiency disease that causes bones to soften and bow, leaving characteristic curves in the leg bones, in multiple young members of the family. The cause is grimly ironic. The Medici children were kept indoors almost constantly, shielded from public view partly for reasons of security in a city where assassination was a regular political tool, and this protection from the outside world also meant near total deprivation of sunlight. The richest family in Europe was giving its children a disease associated with poverty through an excess of caution. Forensic examination of the remains of Francesco Affirm de' Medici and his wife Bianca Capello, who died within a single day of each other in October 1587, found arsenic levels in their bones consistent with poisoning, a finding that contradicts the official cause of death recorded at the time, which was malarial fever, though the conclusion remains disputed by some scholars. Gian Gaston de' Medici, the last Grand Duke of the line, who died in 1737, spent his final years rarely leaving his bed, morbidly obese, suffering from chronic vomiting, and by contemporary accounts, in a state of near-total physical collapse that combined the effects of alcoholism, severe depression, and the accumulated physical toll of a life defined by extreme excess. The Medici story is a variation on the Habsburg theme, not primarily about inbreeding, but about what happens when extraordinary wealth and power remove all natural limits on behavior and simultaneously create environments in which the most basic biological needs, including sunlight, movement, and moderation, are systematically denied. The Wittelsbachs of Bavaria. The Wittelsbach royal family of Bavaria produced some of the most architecturally magnificent monuments in European history, and some of the most thoroughly documented cases of hereditary mental illness in any ruling dynasty of the modern era. The pattern runs across multiple generations and multiple branches, but its most famous expression is King Ludwig II, born in 1845, who ascended to the Bavarian throne at 18 and proceeded to spend the next 2 decades in a state of increasing withdrawal from reality and from the practical demands of governance. Ludwig's obsession was building, specifically the construction of elaborate fairy tale castles in the Bavarian Alps that combined medieval fantasy architecture with cutting-edge 19th century engineering. Neuschwanstein, now one of the most visited tourist sites in the world, was built at a cost equivalent to hundreds of millions of modern dollars, financed through personal debt that Ludwig accumulated to the point of near bankruptcy. He dined alone at enormous tables set for imaginary guests, conducted meetings with his horses, and kept a schedule so entirely nocturnal that his ministers sometimes went weeks without being able to conduct any official business with him. In June 1886, a medical commission declared him insane, a diagnosis that modern psychiatrists have debated, with some suggesting paranoid schizophrenia, others bipolar disorder, and some arguing that his behavior, while extreme, may not have met clinical thresholds for insanity at the time. He was deposed and confined to Berg Castle, and the following day he was found dead in shallow water in a nearby lake alongside his psychiatrist, whose body was found nearby. The circumstances have never been definitively explained. Drowning, murder, and attempted escape resulting in accidental death have all been seriously proposed. His brother Otto was declared insane years earlier and spent most of his adult life in confinement, dying in 1916. Their grandfather, Ludwig, had afraid abdicated in part due to a scandal-producing obsession with a dancer named Lola Montez that destabilized his court and enraged his subjects. Across 4 generations, the Wittelsbach line demonstrated a hereditary pattern of psychiatric illness, schizophrenia, severe depression, obsessive behavior, and emotional dysregulation that no amount of alpine grandeur could fully conceal. Queen Victoria's hemophilia legacy. Queen Victoria of Britain, who reigned from 1837 to 1901 and who became known as the grandmother of Europe for her success in marrying her children and grandchildren into virtually every major royal house on the continent, was simultaneously and unknowingly threading a potentially lethal genetic mutation through those same bloodlines with extraordinary efficiency. Victoria carried a mutation for hemophilia, almost certainly hemophilia B, based on the 2009 DNA analysis of Romanov remains, without being affected by it herself, as female carriers of the condition typically are not. Whether she inherited the mutation from a parent or whether it arose spontaneously in her own DNA remains an open question among geneticists, since no confirmed cases appear in the generations directly before her. What is certain is what happened after. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, had hemophilia and died in 1884 at age 30 after a minor fall caused a brain hemorrhage. Her daughters Alice and Beatrice were carriers, and through them the mutation spread into the Russian, Spanish, and German royal families within a single generation. Through Alice, it reached Tsarevich Alexei Romanov of Russia, whose condition influenced the course of the Russian Revolution. Through Beatrice, it reached the Spanish royal family, King Alfonso XIII. Son Alfonso had hemophilia and died following internal bleeding from a minor car accident, and his son Gonzalo also had the condition and died similarly from injuries that would have been trivial for an unaffected person. The mutation reached the German royal house as well through Princess Irene, another of Alice's daughters. At minimum 10 of Victoria's descendants are documented as either carriers or affected individuals, though the exact count depends on which branches of the family tree are examined and which historical records are considered reliable. The profound irony of Victoria's legacy is this. The diplomatic marriages she engineered were designed to create peace and stability across Europe through family connection, and they did spread her influence into nearly every throne on the continent. But they also spread a genetic disorder that caused the deaths of royal heirs, distorted court politics, and contributed to at least one revolution. The grandmother of Europe was, without knowing it, also the carrier of Europe. Princess Meritaten. The eldest daughter of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti, Meritaten lived during one of ancient Egypt's most unsettling and mysterious periods, the Amarna era of the 14th century before the Common Era. For generations, historians and art scholars dismissed the extraordinary physical features shown in Amarna royal artwork as a deliberate stylistic choice, a new artistic language invented by Akhenaten's court to express divine otherworldliness. The skull stretched backward in long, sweeping elongations. The necks were impossibly thin and drawn out. The jaws were heavy, protruding, and misshapen. The entire royal family looked, in every painting and every carved relief, like no other humans depicted anywhere else in Egyptian art. But forensic and archaeological evidence gathered from skeletal remains across the Amarna royal line has forced a more uncomfortable conclusion. These features were not purely artistic invention, they were rooted in actual physical reality. Mary Titan almost certainly inherited a severe congenital cranial deformity, most likely macrocephaly or dolichocephaly, characterized by an extreme backward elongation of the skull that distorted the entire structure of the head. This was accompanied by an unusually long and thin neck that struggled to support the weight above it, and a prominent misshapen jaw that sat wrong on a face, already distorted by the cranium above. What makes this particularly striking is that these traits appear consistently across the closely related members of the Amarna royal family, pointing unmistakably toward a heritable genetic condition circulating through a bloodline kept deliberately narrow through royal intermarriage. The pharaoh himself, Akhenaten, shows similar skeletal anomalies in candidate mummy remains. Mary Titan did not simply have an unusual appearance. She was born into a family where unusual appearance was encoded into the genetics of dynasty itself. And in one of history's most peculiar ironies, the court around her did not hide these features. They celebrated them, carving them into temple walls, pressing them into gold, painting them across ceremonial objects, and presenting them as marks of divine distinction. The deformity was enshrined as beauty, which means that somewhere in the golden honeytones of ancient Egyptian art, the backward sweep of a severely elongated skull and the thin, strained column of an overstretched neck were preserved, not as evidence of suffering, but as monuments to royal perfection. Queen Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt from approximately 1508 to 1458, before the Common Era, and she did so dressed as a man. Her statues show a powerful, broad-shouldered pharaoh wearing a ceremonial false beard, striding forward in the posture of a king. She built monuments on a scale that rivaled the greatest male pharaohs of Egypt's history. She sent trade expeditions to distant lands and expanded Egypt's wealth and influence for over 2 decades. The public image was immaculate. The physical reality was the opposite. Forensic scans conducted on her mummy have revealed a body that, behind the royal regalia and the carved stone perfection, was being destroyed from multiple directions simultaneously. She suffered from advanced bone cancer, a disease that would have caused progressive skeletal degeneration visible in her posture and movement, grinding her down from the inside even as she projected authority outward. Severe arthritis compounded this, attacking her joints and limiting her mobility further. Her dental decay was significant and disfiguring, with badly rotted and likely lost teeth leaving her mouth in a state of visible deterioration that no amount of ceremonial paint could fully conceal. But perhaps the most remarkable finding involves her skin. Hatshepsut suffered throughout her life from a chronic, genetic, blistering skin disease that covered her body, causing ongoing pain and disfigurement that required constant management. To treat it, she used a skin lotion, and the bottle containing that lotion survived in her tomb long enough for modern forensic chemists to analyze its contents. What they found was alarming. The lotion contained highly carcinogenic compounds. The substance she applied to her body every day to manage her painful skin condition was almost certainly a direct contributor to, or even the cause of, the bone cancer that killed her. The treatment was the poison. The gap between her public image and her physical reality is one of the starkest contrasts in the entire ancient world. On the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, she's carved in polished limestone as a perfect eternal king. In the reality of her body, she was a woman being eaten alive by disease, treating the symptoms with something that was killing her faster, all while ruling one of the ancient world's most powerful civilizations. Cleopatra III, the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, which ruled from the 3rd century before the Common Era through the 1st, operated on a simple and catastrophic principle: the royal bloodline must not be diluted. To preserve what they believed to be divine genetic purity, the Ptolemaic rulers married brothers to sisters, uncles to nieces, and first cousins to first cousins across generation after generation. Cleopatra III, who lived from approximately 161 to 101 before the Common Era, was the accumulated product of this system. She inherited what historians now refer to as the Ptolemaic jaw, a severe mandibular prognathism in which the lower jaw grew dramatically forward and downward past the upper jaw, creating a profile that protruded so far it fundamentally altered every basic function of the face. Chewing was physically difficult and painful. Closing her mouth required active muscular effort that most people never have to consciously make. Speaking clearly was complicated by the mechanical misalignment of her jaw. Historical busts and coins from her era depict this protrusion in unsparing detail, which is particularly notable because ancient royal portraiture typically idealized and flattered its subjects. The fact that the deformity appears even in official, commissioned artwork suggests it was simply too pronounced to smooth away. Alongside the jaw deformity, contemporary accounts from her political enemies, and she had many, described her suffering from profound obesity, a physical condition they weaponized relentlessly against her in political attacks designed to undermine her authority. She was simultaneously one of the most ruthlessly effective political operators of the ancient world, a woman who ordered the assassination of a son she considered a threat to her power, who navigated the collapsing politics of the late Ptolemaic kingdom with cold precision, and who did all of this while inhabiting a body that bore in its very bones and jaw structure the visible cost of what her dynasty had done to its own bloodline across 2 centuries of deliberate inbreeding. Princess Julia Drusilla. Julia Drusilla was born in 39 of the Common Era, the daughter of the Roman Emperor Caligula, one of history's most notoriously unstable and violent rulers. She lived for exactly 2 years. In that brief time, ancient sources record something about her that even by the extraordinary standards of Caligula's household stands out as deeply unsettling. From infancy, Julia Drusilla exhibited an aggressive and unprovoked compulsion to scratch and claw at the faces and eyes of other children around her. a behavior described by ancient writers not as ordinary infant irritability, but as something qualitatively different, more violent, and more targeted. The specific behavioral and physical abnormality, taken alongside the well-documented neurological instability and suspected genetic disorders that ripple through Caligula's family line, points toward a significant congenital condition, one that modern analysis has struggled to name precisely, but that clearly marked her as different from the moment of her birth. The Julio-Claudian bloodline by this point was itself heavily strained by close marriages and the kind of inherited instability that expressed itself across multiple members of the family in markedly different but consistently severe ways. Julia Drusilla never got the chance to live long enough for the full consequences of her birth to become clear. In 41 of the Common Era, Caligula was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard and the Roman Senate, and Julia Drusilla, 2 years old, was killed alongside her parents. She was murdered as political collateral damage, an infant whose only crime was being born to the wrong father at the wrong moment in Roman history. She is one of the youngest figures on this list, and the evidence about her is necessarily fragmentary given the brevity of her life, but what survives is enough to paint a picture of a child already visibly marked, in behavior and in body, by the biological consequences of the bloodline she had inherited. Queen Urraca of Leon and Castile. Urraca, who lived from 1079 to 1126, holds a remarkable and underappreciated place in medieval European history. She was one of the first women to rule a major European kingdom in her own right, governing Leon and Castile independently at a time when female rulership was not just unusual but actively resisted. She fought off her own husband, Alfonso I of Aragon, when he attempted to seize control of her kingdom through their marriage, a conflict that deteriorated into outright military confrontation between a queen and her own spouse. She held her ground, but her body told a different story from her political record. Medieval chroniclers who documented the arc of her reign note with increasing frequency a significant invisible deterioration in her physical appearance as she aged, describing a progressive change in her posture, her movement, and her bearing that contrasted sharply with earlier descriptions of her presence. The condition, almost certainly advanced osteoarthritis based on the descriptions available, caused a progressive and debilitating stooping of her spine and deformity of her joints that worsened steadily across the later years of her reign. Multiple pregnancies, endured without adequate nutrition, without modern medical support, and under the relentless physical demands of a woman who was simultaneously running a kingdom and fighting a war, compounded the joint damage significantly. By the end of her life, the physical contrast between the woman who had commanded armies and outmaneuvered a king and the stooped, pain-marked figure described in late chronicles was severe enough that chroniclers felt it worth noting explicitly. This matters beyond simple physical description. In medieval Europe, a queen's authority was inseparable from her physical presence, her ability to appear at ceremonies, to project command, to fill a room. A body that was visibly deteriorating, bent forward, and struggling to move was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political vulnerability in a world that read the body of a ruler as evidence of their fitness to rule. Infanta Maria Anna of Spain. Maria Anna of Spain, born in 1606 and dead by 1646 at the age of 39, was a direct product of one of the most sustained and catastrophic experiments in deliberate genetic narrowing that European history has to offer. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty pursued a policy of uncle-niece and first-cousin marriages across multiple generations with a consistency that eventually produced results so severe they contributed to the biological extinction of the dynasty itself. Maria Anna inherited an extreme manifestation of what became known historically as the Habsburg lip, technically a form of mandibular prognathism, in which the lower jaw extended so dramatically forward that her upper and lower teeth could not physically make contact with each other. This was not a subtle misalignment. The gap between her upper and lower teeth was wide enough that closing her mouth fully required deliberate, sustained muscular effort. Chewing food was a process that caused ongoing discomfort. Speaking clearly was complicated by the mechanical reality of a jaw that sat in the wrong position relative to everything above it. What makes this particularly striking is the visual evidence. Royal portraiture of the period was a genre built on flattery. Court painters were paid to make their subjects look commanding, beautiful, and serene. And yet, in the official portraits of Maria Anna and her Habsburg relatives, the jaw deformity is plainly visible even through the idealization, because it was simply too pronounced to paint away, without producing something that looked nothing like the subject at all. The downstream consequence of what her dynasty was doing to its own genetics would reach its endpoint in her nephew Charles II of Spain, born so severely impaired by accumulated inbreeding that he could not walk until the age of 8, could not chew food at all, and was physically and cognitively incapacitated to a degree that effectively ended the Spanish Habsburg line. Maria Anna was not the endpoint. She was one of the clearest visible waypoints on the road to it. Princess Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici was born in 1667 and lived until 1743, and she carried the particular weight of being the very last lineal descendant of the main branch of the House of Medici. The Medici had built Florence. They had bankrolled the Renaissance. Their name was synonymous with art, power, and cultural patronage on a scale that shaped the entire trajectory of Western civilization. Anna Maria Luisa watched that dynasty die, and she watched it die in her own body. Historical accounts and period evidence indicate that she contracted syphilis, which went inadequately treated across the later decades of her life. In its tertiary stage, which develops when the disease is left to progress unchecked across years or decades, syphilis produces a specific and devastating pattern of physical destruction. Gummas form, which are painful subcutaneous tumors that push upward through the skin in grotesque lumps, distorting the surface of the face and body. Deep, weeping skin lesions open and refuse to heal. Over time, the disease attacks bone structure directly. It can destroy the nasal septum entirely, causing the nose to collapse inward, and it erodes the facial bones beneath the skin, fundamentally reshaping the face from its underlying architecture outward. The disfigurement is progressive and visible and worsening, and there's no reversing it once the tertiary stage has taken hold. Anna Maria Luisa spent the later chapters of her life in this state of accelerating physical deterioration. And yet, in 1737, while her body was being dismantled by disease, she negotiated the Patto de Familia, one of the most significant cultural preservation agreements in recorded history. The agreement stipulated that the entire Medici art collection, every painting, every sculpture, every artifact accumulated by her family across 3 centuries of patronage would remain in Florence for the public rather than being dispersed to private buyers or foreign courts upon her death. The woman watching her own face cave inward was simultaneously ensuring that the art her family had spent generations collecting would belong to the world forever. So she died in 1743. The collection stayed. Duchesse Marie-Thérèse of France. Marie-Thérèse of France was born in 1778. The eldest daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and she's the only member of the immediate royal family who survived the French Revolution. Her parents were executed. Her younger brother, the Dauphin Louis Charles, died in imprisonment under circumstances so grim that they remain one of the Revolution's most haunting episodes. Her Aunt Elizabeth was guillotined. Marie-Thérèse survived by enduring years of imprisonment in the Temple Tower, beginning when she was 14 years old, in conditions of severe malnutrition, total deprivation of sunlight, damp cold, and unrelenting psychological trauma. These were not incidental hardships. They occurred during the critical years of her physical development, the period when the human body is still forming its bone density, completing its growth, and establishing the structural foundations it will rely on for the rest of its life. The result was permanent. The combination of nutritional deficiency and the complete absence of sunlight produced what would now be recognized as a form of developmental rickets and severe vitamin D deficiency, leaving her bones and joints structurally compromised in ways that could not be corrected once she emerged. When she was finally released from prison, observers noted that she walked with a distinct, labored, altered gait that spoke clearly to the joint and bone damage done during her years of captivity. A permanent pronounced stoop shaped her posture for the rest of her long life, a physical archive of what had been done to her body during the years the Revolution spent killing her family around her. She lived until 1851, surviving into her 70s, and she remained politically active across the decades, becoming known as Madame Royale, and continuing to pursue the Bourbon cause with a tenacity that earned her the description of being the only man in the family. She carried the stoop and the altered gait for all of it, a walking record of a childhood spent in a stone tower without light, food, or family. Princess Charlotte of Wales. Princess Charlotte of Wales was born in 1796, the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent who would later become George IV. And she was one of the most beloved public figures in early 19th century Britain, the affection for her crossed class lines in a way that was genuinely unusual for the period. When she died in 1817 at the age of 21, the grief was national and overwhelming, felt in the streets and in homes across the country, in a way that her father, deeply unpopular, could never have inspired. She died not from disease, not from war, not from any of the causes that claimed royal lives across history, but from what the medical establishment tasked with saving her did to her body in the process. She underwent a labor that lasted 50 hours, with the baby positioned incorrectly in the birth canal, a situation that, even without any additional complications, represented a catastrophic obstetric crisis by the standards of any era. The royal physicians attending her followed the medical doctrine of the time, which held that bloodletting and enforced dietary restriction were appropriate tools for managing a laboring woman's constitution. They bled her repeatedly across those 50 hours. They withheld food. The combined effect was a body already being physically destroyed by 50 hours of obstructed labor that had also been systematically drained of blood and starved of the energy it needed to survive what was happening to it. Hours after delivering a stillborn son, Charlotte hemorrhaged massively and internally, a physiological catastrophe that her blood-depleted, exhausted, and starved body had no resources left to survive. Her physician, Sir Richard Croft, was so consumed by guilt over what had happened that he shot himself 3 months after her death. The physical destruction visited on Charlotte's body in those final hours represents a specific kind of horror, a young woman's body dismantled not by illness but by the medical protocols designed to protect her, each intervention making the final outcome more inevitable. Queen Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou, born in 1430 and dead in 1482, was one of the most formidable political and military figures of 15th century Europe, and the fact that she is not more widely known is one of history's more persistent oversights. During the Wars of the Roses, while her husband Henry VI drifted in and out of catatonic states that left him effectively non-functional as a ruler, Margaret held the Lancastrian cause together through sheer force of will, political intelligence, and, when necessary, military command. She negotiated alliances, raised armies, and fought for the Lancastrian claim to the English throne across decades of brutal conflict. Then everything collapsed. The Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 destroyed the Lancastrian cause decisively. Her only son, Edward of Westminster, was killed either in the battle or immediately after, depending on which account you accept. She was captured and imprisoned. She was eventually ransomed and returned to France, where she spent her final years in impoverished exile, stripped of everything she had spent her life fighting to preserve. The physical consequences of this total collapse were severe and visible. Chroniclers from her final years describe an aggressive, degenerative skin condition that ravaged her features with a thoroughness that left the once celebrated beauty of her youth completely unrecognizable. Described variously as severe psoriasis, systemic ulceration, or a leprosy-adjacent disease, the condition caused her skin to peel away, to blacken in patches, and to ulcerate, peeling back from her face and leaving the raw underlying tissue exposed. A woman who had been described as strikingly beautiful when she arrived in England as a teenage queen in the 1440s became, in her final years in France, a face rebuilt entirely by disease and grief, unrecognizable to anyone who had known her before. The disease and the exile and the loss mapped themselves onto her body with a completeness that made her physical appearance, by the end, a portrait of everything the Wars of the Roses had taken from her. Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Alexandra Feodorovna, born in 1872 and executed in 1918, was the last empress of Russia, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II, and a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She is best known in historical memory for being a carrier of the hemophilia B gene that she inherited from Victoria and passed on to her son, Tsarevich Alexei, whose dangerous and unpredictable bleeding episodes became one of the defining crises of the late Romanov dynasty and opened the door to Rasputin's malevolent influence on the imperial household. But while Alexei's condition was politically explosive and publicly known, Alexandra's own body was undergoing its own quiet and severe deterioration across the same years. She suffered from debilitating sciatica, a condition involving chronic agonizing nerve pain radiating from the lower spine down through the legs, combined with severe progressive joint inflammation and a deteriorating circulatory system that left her chronically exhausted and prone to episodes of extreme physical weakness. Observers from the period describe her as visibly aged beyond her years, physically diminished in a way that her ceremonial role as empress made impossible to hide entirely. By the final years of the Romanov dynasty, the deterioration had progressed to the point where she could no longer walk comfortably or reliably. She moved through the palace in a wheelchair for significant periods, a fact kept as concealed as possible from public view, because the image of an immobilized empress was a political liability in an empire already destabilizing. The political consequences of her physical incapacitation compounded every other crisis surrounding the dynasty. Her inability to maintain public appearances, her dependence on Rasputin to manage Alexei's hemophilia episodes, and the perception of a court operating behind closed doors around a failing empress fed the conspiracy theories and public resentment that accelerated the Romanov collapse. She died in July of 1918, shot alongside her husband and her children in the basement of the Yepatiev house in Yekaterinburg, a body that had already been failing for years, ended finally by a firing squad in a cellar. Infanta Maria Teresa of Spain. Maria Teresa of Spain was born in 1882, a descendant of the sustained intermarriages between the Spanish and Austrian royal houses that had been producing increasingly fragile constitutions across the 19th century and into the 20th. She was born into a body that her genetics had already compromised before she drew her first breath, inheriting what contemporaries described as an inherently frail constitution, characterized by structural bone weakness, a fragile circulatory system, and an overall physiological vulnerability that placed hard limits on what her body could endure. She endured 3 consecutive pregnancies, in close succession, a physical demand that would tax even a robust constitution, and that proved catastrophic for hers. Each pregnancy depleted her already compromised physical resources further, triggering progressive systemic complications, including severe circulatory stress that compounded with each subsequent birth. Following the delivery of her 3rd child, her health collapsed entirely and suddenly. She suffered a devastating stroke and died at the age of 29. An age at which most people are at or approaching peak physical condition. Her death in 1912 received relatively little historical attention compared to the grander royal tragedies of earlier centuries, probably because by the early 20th century, the age of absolute royal power was itself ending, and the death of a Spanish infanta no longer carried the political weight it once would have. But what her story represents in the longer arc of European royal genetics is significant. She is one of the clearest laid examples of a royal body systematically broken by the biological cost of dynasties that built themselves through blood, married inward for centuries to keep power concentrated, and eventually produced descendants whose bodies could not sustain the ordinary demands of life. 3 pregnancies, a stroke at 29, the genetics of an empire's ambition expressed finally as a body that simply gave out. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.